The year is 1347, and you're standing on the harbour at Messina, Sicily, watching 12 galleys limp into port like wounded animals seeking shelter. But these aren't ordinary merchant vessels returning from profitable ventures in the east. These are ships of the damned, carrying cargo that will reshape the very fabric of the European civilization. You can smell them before you see the details, a stench that cuts through the normal harbour odours of fish, tar and salt. It's the smell of death, sweet and cloying, mixed with something else you can't quite identify. As the ships draw closer, you notice the eerie silence. No shouting sailors, no calls from the crew to the dock workers, just the creak of wood and the slap of waves against hulls that seem to move with supernatural purpose. The first galley bumps against the dock with a hollow thud that echoes across the water like a funeral bell. You're among the crowd of curious onlookers, merchants hoping for exotic goods, officials checking manifests, families waiting for loved ones. But as the gangplank drops, what emerges isn't the usual bustle of international trade. A figure staggers down the wooden ramp, more corpse than man. His skin has turned an unnatural shade of black and blue, with grotesque swellings the size of eggs bulging from his neck and armpits. He takes 3 steps before collapsing onto the dock, blood frothing from his mouth as his body convulses in its final throes. Behind him, another sailor appears, then another, each in various stages of the same horrifying transformation. The crowd recoils in terror, but it's already too late. You've breathed the same air, touched the same dock rails, stood in the same space as death itself. The harbour master, a portly man named Giuseppe, whom you've known for years, approaches the ships with official authority masking his obvious fear. "What port did you sail from?" he shouts to the few sailors still standing. "Kaffa," comes the weak reply from a man whose face is already showing the telltale signs, dark spots appearing like ink stains on parchment. The Mongols, they catapulted, the bodies over the walls, the dead, so many dead. You watch Giuseppe step back, his face pale with understanding. Kaffa, that distant trading post on the Black Sea, might as well be another world. But the merchants' tales have reached even this Sicilian port. Stories of a strange sickness that kills in days, turning men into walking corpses before claiming their lives. Stories dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of frightened travellers. But here's the proof, stumbling and dying before your very eyes. The rats come next. They pour from the ships like a dark tide, their bodies mangy and many already showing signs of sickness themselves. They scatter into the city's narrow streets, carrying with them tiny passengers, fleas that will soon become the instruments of apocalypse. You don't know this yet, of course. Medical knowledge in 1347 doesn't extend to understanding disease vectors or bacterial infections. You still believe in the 4 humours, in bad air, in God's wrath made manifest. As you stand frozen in horror, watching sailor after sailor succumb to this mysterious plague, you're witnessing the opening act of the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. Within 4 years, this disease will claim somewhere between 75 and 200 million lives. It will kill 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. It will leave entire villages empty, create labour shortages that fundamentally alter the social order, and spark religious movements, persecution of minorities, and cultural upheavals that will echo through the centuries. But you don't know any of this yet. All you know is that death has arrived in your harbour, and it's looking for new hosts. The surviving sailors are quarantined in a hastily designated warehouse, though the concept of quarantine is still primitive. 40 days of isolation based on biblical precedent rather than scientific understanding. The ships themselves are burned, sending clouds of black smoke into the Mediterranean sky like funeral pyres. But the damage is already done. The plague has made landfall in Europe, and it's hungry. Within days, the first cases appear among the dock workers, then their families, then their neighbours. The pattern is always the same. Sudden fever, excruciating pain, swellings in the lymph nodes that grow to impossible sizes, skin that turns black as if charred from within, and finally, death. Usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. The speed is what terrifies people most. This isn't like other diseases that might linger for weeks or months, giving families time to pray, to seek remedies, to say goodbye. This is swift and merciless, cutting people down in their prime with an efficiency that seems almost supernatural. You return home that evening to your family, your wife Maria, your 3 children, your elderly father who fought in the last Sicilian War, and you say nothing about what you've seen. How could you explain something so beyond comprehension? How could you burden them with knowledge of approaching doom? Instead, you eat your simple dinner of bread and fish, listen to your children's laughter, and try to pretend that the images burned into your memory are just nightmares that will fade with time. But deep in your bones, you know that something fundamental has changed. The world you woke up to this morning no longer exists. Outside, the bells of Messina's churches begin to toll, not for prayer, but for the dead. 3 weeks have passed since the ships arrived, and you're living in a world that no longer makes sense. The morning bells that once called people to prayer now ring constantly for the dead, their bronze voices creating a funeral dirge that never ends. You've stopped counting the bodies. Your neighbour, Antonio, was the first on your street to fall ill. You remember watching him stumble to his door, clutching his neck where a lump the size of a chicken egg had formed overnight. His wife, Francesca, called for the physician, but Dr. Benedetto never came. He was already dead, along with half the medical men in the city. Those who remained were either overwhelmed beyond capacity or had fled to the countryside, abandoning their Hippocratic oaths for the slim hope of survival. The city has developed its own rhythm of death. In the morning, carts roll through the streets while drivers call, "Bring out your dead," in voices muffled by strips of cloth soaked in vinegar and herbs. By noon, the cart is full, bodies stacked like cordwood. Some are wrapped in shrouds, but increasingly, people simply carry out their deceased family members in whatever clothing they died in. The luxury of proper burial rites has become impossible when dozens die every day. You've learned to recognise the stages of the pestilence, though you still don't understand what causes it. First comes the fever, sudden and intense, leaving victims shivering despite the Mediterranean heat. Then the pain, excruciating agony that seems to radiate from the lymph nodes as they swell into grotesque buboes. The largest you've seen was on young Carlo, the baker's son, a mass under his arm that grew to the size of a newborn's head, before bursting in a shower of pus and blood. The smell is everywhere now. Sweet, cloying, inescapable. It seeps through windows, clings to clothing, follows you into your dreams. It's the smell of civilization rotting from within. You've taken to burning herbs constantly. Rosemary, thyme, anything that might cleanse the air. The more superstitious have taken to carrying bundles of flowers, believing that good smells can ward off the poisonous vapours that everyone assumes cause the disease. Your wife Maria contracted it 5 days ago. You found her collapsed in the kitchen, her face flushed with fever, dark spots already appearing on her skin like scattered coins. The swellings under her arms came next, growing visibly larger each hour. You've been caring for her alone because there's no one else left. The priest died a week ago, along with most of the other families on your street. The children ask why Mama won't wake up properly, why she thrashes and moans through the night, why her skin has turned such terrible colours. You tell them she's sick and will get better, but you know you're lying. You've seen this progression too many times. The black patches spreading across her body mark her as surely as any executioner's axe. Food has become impossible to find. The market's closed when the vendors died. The farms outside the city are empty. Either the farmers have fled, or they've succumbed to the same plague that's devouring the urban population. You've been rationing the last of your stored grain, mixing it with water to make thin gruel that barely sustains life. Your father, weakened by age and hunger, grows thinner each day. The social order that once defined your world has completely collapsed. There are no more city officials. The magistrates either died or abandoned their posts. The wealthy merchant families who once ruled the city's commerce have either perished or fled to their country estates, taking their gold and leaving behind empty palazzos that now serve as makeshift morgues. Bands of desperate people roam the streets, breaking into abandoned homes to search for food or valuables. Some have turned to religious extremism, believing the plague is God's punishment for humanity's sins. You've seen processions of flagellants moving through the city, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers and crying for divine mercy. They believe that sufficient penance might appease God's wrath and end the pestilence. But the plague kills the devout just as readily as the sinful. Others have turned to scapegoating. Last week, a mob attacked the Jewish quarter, accusing them of poisoning the wells. You watched from your window as they dragged families from their homes, setting fire to houses with people still inside. The screams mixed with the constant tolling of death bells to create a symphony of human madness. The irony wasn't lost on you. The Jewish families were dying of plague at the same rate as everyone else, yet somehow they became responsible for everyone's suffering. Trade has stopped completely. The harbour that once buzzed with international commerce now sits empty, except for the occasional ship bringing more death from distant ports. The great Mediterranean trading network that connected Europe to Asia, Africa and the Middle East has shattered like glass, leaving isolated communities to face the apocalypse alone. Your youngest child, little Giuseppe, developed a fever this morning. He's only 6 years old, barely old enough to understand why the world has become such a frightening place. You hold him against your chest, feeling the heat radiating from his small body, and you know that death has finally come for your family directly. The mathematics of survival have become brutally simple. In a city of 30,000, perhaps 5,000 remain alive. The rest lie buried in mass graves outside the city walls, or simply rot where they fell. Entire bloodlines have been extinguished. Craft guilds that took centuries to develop have vanished overnight. The accumulated knowledge of generations, how to weave certain fabrics, how to work particular metals, how to read ancient texts, dies with the plague victims. You look at your wife's wasted face, at your fevered son, at your father growing weaker by the hour, and you realise you're witnessing the end of everything you've ever known. This isn't just disease, it's the dissolution of civilization itself. This sun sets over Messina, painting the sky the colour of blood and fire, and you wonder if anyone will be left alive to see it rise again. 6 months have passed since the plague ships first entered your harbour, and you're one of perhaps 1,000 survivors in what was once a thriving city of 30,000 souls. You walk through streets that have become monuments to human extinction, past houses that serve as tombs for entire families who died within their walls. Your wife Maria is buried in the mass grave beyond the city walls, along with your father and your youngest son Giuseppe. Little Marco, your 8-year-old, survived the fever through some miracle you'll never understand, though it left him changed, quieter, more serious, with eyes that have seen too much for his age. Your daughter Eleanor, barely 14, has become the woman of the house by necessity, tending to the remnants of your shattered family with a competence that would have been remarkable in peacetime and is simply essential now. The social transformation is unlike anything in recorded history. The rigid hierarchies that once defined European society have collapsed as thoroughly as the population itself. Noble families that ruled for centuries have been extinguished entirely, their titles meaningless when there's no one left to acknowledge them. The peasants who survive suddenly find themselves with options their ancestors could never have imagined. Empty land to claim, abandoned houses to occupy, trades to enter without the traditional apprenticeships and guild restrictions. You've taken over Antonio's carpentry shop, not through any formal transfer of ownership, but because you're one of the few people left who knows how to work wood, and the survivors need furniture, repairs, coffins. The old guild system that would have prevented such a career change simply no longer exists. The master carpenters are dead. The guild leaders are dead. The city officials who would have enforced such restrictions are dead. Labour has become incredibly valuable overnight. Where once a dozen men might compete for a single job, now you can demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The survivors need everything rebuilt, and there are so few hands left to do the work. The economic laws that governed your father's generation have been rewritten by mass death. But prosperity means little when civilization itself hangs by a thread. The infrastructure of daily life, the networks of trade, the systems of law enforcement, the traditions of governance has been shattered. The surviving priest, Father Marco, who recovered from a mild case of the plague through another inexplicable miracle, holds services for congregations of 12 people in a cathedral that once hosted hundreds. The legal system operates on informal agreements and community consensus since there are no judges left alive. The psychological toll may be the heaviest burden of all. Every survivor is traumatized in ways that have no names. You've watched your entire world die, person by person, family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood. You've seen children, orphaned and parents driven mad by grief. You've witnessed the complete breakdown of social norms as people faced their own mortality and found civilization wanting. The stories reaching you from other parts of Europe suggest Messina's experience isn't unique, it's universal. Florence has lost half its population. Paris reports similar devastation. London's chroniclers describe mass graves that stretch beyond the city limits. The plague has swept across the continent like a scythe, cutting down the population with mechanical efficiency. Some estimate that Europe has lost a third of its people. Others suggest it might be as much as half. Religious faith has been both strengthened and shattered by the experience. Some survivors, like yourself, find comfort in the belief that God has preserved you for some purpose, that divine providence explains your family's partial survival, while others perished completely. But many others have lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the idea of a benevolent God with the random, merciless nature of the plague's victims. Children died just as readily as sinners. Priests succumbed at the same rate as criminals. The persecution of minorities has reached horrific levels. Jewish communities throughout Europe have been blamed for the plague, accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic. You've heard reports of entire Jewish populations being murdered by Christian mobs seeking someone to blame for the incomprehensible catastrophe. The irony that Jews died at similar rates to Christians is lost on people desperate for simple explanations in a situation that defies understanding. Art and literature are beginning to reflect the transformation. The few remaining scholars and artists speak of a new sensibility emerging from the plague years, a fascination with death, a questioning of traditional authority, an emphasis on the fleeting nature of human existence. The plague has become a watershed moment that divides history into before and after. Children born in the post-plague world will grow up in a fundamentally different Europe than the one their parents knew. Trade patterns across the known world have been permanently altered. The great commercial networks that connected Europe to Asia through the Mediterranean and overland routes have been disrupted for years. Some will never recover. Entire trading cities have been depopulated. The economic relationships that took centuries to develop have vanished, leaving survivors to rebuild commerce from scratch. You think about the future often as you work in Antonio's carpenter shop, shaping wood that will outlast your own life. What kind of world will little Marco inherit? What lessons will be drawn from these 4 years of mass death? Will humanity learn something from this brush with extinction? Or will the lessons be forgotten as survivors rebuild their lives? The plague is finally burning itself out, having run out of new victims in most areas. But its effects will echo through the centuries. Labour shortages will eventually lead to higher wages for workers, challenging the feudal system. The breakdown of traditional authority will contribute to new forms of government and social organisation. The questioning of religious certainty will help lay groundwork for the Renaissance and Reformation. Standing in your doorway at sunset, watching your surviving children play in streets where silence has replaced the bustle of urban life, you understand that you've lived through one of history's great turning points. The world that emerges from these ashes will be fundamentally different from the one that existed before the plague ships arrived in your harbour. The Black Death has ended, but its legacy has just begun. It's October 1348, and you're standing in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, watching the greatest city in Europe die one street at a time. Paris, the jewel of Christendom, home to over 200,000 souls, has become a charnel house that stretches as far as the eye can see. The plague arrived here 6 months after Messina, carried by merchants fleeing the Italian coast, and it's been feeding ever since. You can hear the death carts rattling down the Rue Saint-Denis from your position near the cathedral steps. The wooden wheels clatter against cobblestones with the rhythm of a funeral march, accompanied by the driver's hoarse cry, "Apportez vos morts," bring out your dead. It's a sound that's become as familiar as church bells, and far more frequent. The bells themselves have mostly stopped ringing, too few priests left alive to pull the ropes. The smell hits you first, always the smell. Sweet, cloying, mixed with the smoke from the constant fires burning at every major intersection. The authorities ordered the fires lit months ago, believing they would purify the poisonous air that everyone assumes carries the pestilence. Instead, they've created a hellscape where the living stumble through perpetual twilight, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes streaming from the acrid smoke that never clears. You're here because you're one of the few royal scribes still alive, tasked with recording the catastrophe for whatever government might survive this apocalypse. King Philip VI himself fled to his castle at Vincennes weeks ago, leaving Paris to fend for itself. The Parlement has ceased to function. Too few magistrates remain breathing to conduct business. The university, once the intellectual heart of Europe, has closed its doors after professors and students died at rates that made education impossible. A group of flagellants processes past the cathedral, their backs bloody from self-imposed whippings, chanting prayers in Latin mixed with French. Dieu nous pardonne nos péchés. God forgive us our sins. They believe the plague is divine punishment for humanity's wickedness, and that sufficient penance might appease God's wrath. You've seen dozens of these processions, some numbering in the hundreds, all seeking salvation through voluntary suffering. Behind them walks a different kind of procession, a mob carrying torches and crude weapons, heading toward the Jewish quarter. The scapegoating has reached fever pitch here, just as it has across Europe. Last month they burned the entire Jewish community of Strasbourg alive. Paris's Jews have fared little better, accused of poisoning wells despite the obvious fact that they're dying at the same rate as everyone else. The economic collapse is total. The great markets of Les Halles stand empty, their stalls shuttered, their merchant families either dead or fled. The craft guilds that once regulated every aspect of Parisian commerce have disintegrated. Master craftsmen with decades of experience lie rotting in mass graves while their workshops stand silent. The complex networks of credit and trade that made Paris the commercial hub of Northern Europe have snapped like overloaded rope. You enter the Hôtel Dieu, the great hospital next to Notre Dame, to document conditions there. What you find defies description. Bodies are stacked 3 deep in beds meant for one. The few surviving nuns move like ghosts through corridors thick with the stench of decay and human waste. Sister Marie Claire, one of only 5 nuns left from an original community of 40, tells you they're simply waiting for death now. They've run out of medicine, food, and hope. "We pray for the souls of the departed," she whispers, her voice barely audible through the cloth wrapped around her face. "But mostly, we pray for our own deliverance." Her eyes are hollow with exhaustion and trauma. The look of someone who has seen hell manifest on earth. In the wealthy districts near the Louvre, entire mansions stand empty, their noble families extinct. The Hôtel de Bourbon, once home to one of France's most powerful families, is now a tomb where servants barricaded themselves in with their dead masters. The smell seeping from its windows tells you that no one inside survived the siege of disease. The poor quarters tell an even grimmer story. In the narrow alleys of Saint-Antoine, bodies lie where they fell, sometimes for days, because there's no one left to collect them. Children as young as 5 wander the streets alone, their parents dead, surviving on scraps and the occasional charity of equally desperate neighbours. Many of these orphans show the telltale signs of infection, the fever, the swellings, the black patches on their skin that mark them for death. You meet Guillaume, a baker who somehow survived the plague that killed his wife and 3 children. He's kept his shop open more from habit than purpose. There's little grain to make bread and fewer customers to buy it. "I bake for the dead now," he tells you with a laugh that borders on madness. "They're my best customers. They never complain about the quality." The intellectual life that once made Paris the Athens of the medieval world has vanished, overnight. The libraries stand unattended, their manuscripts gathering dust while the scholars who could read them decompose in unmarked graves. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, commentaries on Aristotle, theological treatises, mathematical innovations, sit idle while civilization crumbles around them. By evening, as you walk back to your quarters near the cathedral, you pass the mass burial ground outside the city walls. It's a sight that will haunt your dreams for whatever remains of your life. The pit is so large you can barely see across it, filled with layer upon layer of human bodies. The gravediggers work by torchlight, throwing lime over each layer to slow decomposition, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar and herbs. Paris, the city that once boasted it was the most beautiful in the world, has become Europe's largest cemetery. Of its 200,000 inhabitants, perhaps 50,000 remain alive. The rest lie in mass graves or rot in abandoned houses throughout the city. The capital of France has been reduced to a collection of empty buildings and traumatized survivors, waiting for either death or deliverance. December 1348 finds you aboard a merchant vessel approaching the Thames estuary, watching the smoke rise from London like signals from a city under siege. You're a Flemish cloth trader who's been travelling through Europe's major ports, and what you've seen has convinced you that this plague is unlike anything in human history. London is your last stop before returning home to Bruges, assuming there's still a home to return to. The Thames is nearly empty, a shocking sight for anyone who knew London before the pestilence arrived. This river was once thick with vessels from every corner of the known world, Hanseatic traders from the Baltic, Genoese galleys from the Mediterranean, fishing boats from the North Sea. Now you count perhaps a dozen ships in the entire harbour, and half of those appear abandoned, their crews either dead or fled. London Bridge comes into view, that magnificent stone structure lined with shops and houses that made it one of the wonders of Europe. But something's wrong with the scene. Too many of the buildings show no signs of life, no smoke from chimneys, no activity around the shops. As your ship draws closer, you can see that some of the bridge's famous structures have been boarded up entirely, while others show the black stains of fire damage around their windows. The city's walls, built by the Romans and reinforced by the Normans, still stand proud against the grey December sky. But the guards who once manned the gates are nowhere to be seen. Your ship docks at Queenhithe without any inspection, without any documentation, without anyone seeming to care what cargo you might be bringing into the kingdom. In normal times, royal customs officials would have swarmed the vessel, demanding taxes and permits. Today, you simply tie up at an empty wharf and walk into the city unchallenged. The silence is the first thing that strikes you. London was never a quiet city. The constant hammering of craftsmen, the calls of street vendors, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones created an urban symphony that never stopped. Now you hear only the wind whistling through empty streets and the distant sound of church bells tolling for the dead. Even the famous cacophony of London Bridge has been reduced to an occasional creak of timbers in the wind. You make your way up Fish Street toward the city centre, and the devastation becomes apparent. Shop after shop stands empty, their owners either dead or fled to the countryside. The famous Cheapside Market, once the commercial heart of England, is a ghost town. The stalls that once displayed goods from across Europe now stand bare, their awnings flapping in the cold wind like funeral shrouds. The Great Hall of the Guildhall stands empty, its doors barred shut. The guilds that once controlled London's economy, the mercers, the drapers, the goldsmiths, have ceased to function. Their members lie in the plague pits outside the city walls, or in the overcrowded graveyards of London's 100 parishes. The complex system of apprenticeships, journeymen and master craftsmen that took centuries to develop has collapsed in a matter of months. At St. Paul's Cathedral, you encounter one of the few signs of organised activity remaining in the city. Bishop Ralph Stratford is conducting a mass burial in the cathedral yard, but he's not following traditional rites. There are too many bodies and too few priests for individual services. Instead, he's blessing dozens of corpses at once, wrapped in shrouds or simply lying in their death clothes, before they're carried to the mass graves outside the city. God's will be done, the bishop intones over the pile of bodies, but his voice carries none of the certainty that once characterised the church's response to earthly suffering. Even the clergy seem shaken by the plague's seemingly random selection of victims. Why did some priests survive while others perished? Why did prayer and penance seem to offer no protection against the pestilence? You witness a scene that encapsulates London's breakdown when you encounter a group of survivors looting the mansion of a wealthy merchant family in Cripplegate. The looters aren't common criminals. They're well-dressed citizens, probably neighbours of the deceased family, systematically stripping the house of anything valuable. When you ask about the owners, a woman in a blood-stained gown tells you matter-of-factly that they all died last week, and the house would only rot if left empty. The legal system has collapsed entirely. The courts of King's Bench and Common Pleas have closed. Too few judges and lawyers remain alive to conduct business. Property rights, the foundation of feudal society, have become meaningless when there's no authority to enforce them, and often no heirs to inherit. Abandoned houses are simply occupied by whoever gets there first, regardless of legal ownership. The royal government has largely ceased to function. King Edward III has retreated to Windsor Castle, cancelling the planned session of Parliament when it became clear that too few Lords and Commons would survive to attend. The elaborate bureaucracy that governed England, the Chancery, the Exchequer, the royal courts, operates with skeleton crews of traumatised survivors trying to maintain some semblance of order. In the poorer districts near the walls, the situation defies comprehension. Entire tenements stand empty, their inhabitants dead, the surviving neighbours too frightened or too weak to enter and clear out the bodies. The result is blocks of buildings that have become massive tombs, their windows and doors sealed by fearful survivors who hope that ignorance might provide protection. You spend a night in what was once the Tabard Inn, made famous by pilgrims travelling to Canterbury. The innkeeper, Thomas, is one of only 3 people left in the establishment that once housed dozens of travellers nightly. He serves you watered ale and bread that taste like sawdust, explaining that grain shipments stopped months ago when the countryside emptied. Chaucer stayed here last year, Thomas tells you, referring to the royal servant who's been collecting tales from travellers. Said he might write about the pilgrims he met. Wonder if he's still alive to write anything now. The casual acceptance of universal death has become commonplace among survivors, a psychological defence against the magnitude of the catastrophe. London, once home to perhaps 80,000 people, now shelters fewer than 20,000 souls. The great city that was the pride of England has been reduced to scattered pockets of traumatised survivors struggling to maintain the basic functions of urban life. The elaborate social and economic networks that made London one of Europe's greatest cities have been severed as thoroughly as if the plague were a sword cutting through the fabric of civilization itself. March 1349 brings you to Florence, and you're witnessing the death of the Renaissance before it's even begun. As a Venetian merchant who has travelled throughout the plague-stricken regions, you thought you understood the scope of the catastrophe. But Florence, beautiful, wealthy, sophisticated Florence, shows you that even paradise can become hell when death comes calling. The city that gave birth to Dante and nurtured the greatest artists, philosophers and bankers in Europe is now a museum of human extinction. You approach through the Oltrarno district, crossing the Ponte Vecchio, that famous bridge lined with goldsmiths' shops that once displayed treasures from across the known world. Today, the shops stand empty, their shutters closed, their treasures either looted or left to gather dust while their owners rot in unmarked graves. The Arno River flows sluggishly beneath the bridge, its waters darkened by more than silt. Bodies have been thrown into the river for months, so many that downstream communities refuse to drink from it. The magnificent city that once prided itself on cleanliness and civic order has been reduced to using its greatest waterway as a sewer for the dead. You're carrying letters from your surviving business partners in Venice, trying to determine which of your Florentine contacts remain alive. The list grows shorter with each inquiry. The Medici Bank, which financed trade across Europe, has closed its doors, not from lack of gold, but from lack of living bankers to count it. Giovanni de' Medici survived the plague, but most of his staff and many of his partners did not. The Wool Guild, the Arte di Lana that made Florence rich through textile production, has ceased operations. The complex networks of international trade that brought English wool to Florentine workshops, where it was transformed into luxury fabrics sold across Europe, have collapsed. The workshops stand silent, their looms empty, their master craftsmen dead. Centuries of accumulated expertise in dyeing, weaving and finishing cloth have vanished in less than 2 years. You visit the Basilica of Santa Croce, where Giotto's frescoes still blaze with colour on the walls, but the church itself has become a morgue. Bodies line the nave, awaiting burial in ground that's already saturated with corpses. The art that once celebrated human dignity and divine beauty now overlooks scenes of mass death that would have been unimaginable when the paint was still wet. The intellectual life that made Florence the Athens of medieval Europe has been shattered. The university's halls stand empty, their professors and students equally likely to be dead. The libraries where humanist scholars were beginning to rediscover classical texts now sit unattended, their precious manuscripts gathering dust. The revolution in learning that was beginning to transform European thought has been stopped in its tracks by the simple fact that scholars can't survive to study. Boccaccio, the great storyteller, is one of the few intellectual figures still alive in Florence. You encounter him near Santa Maria del Fiore, the cathedral that will never be completed as originally planned. Too many architects and stonemasons have died. He's documenting the plague's effects for posterity, though he wonders aloud whether there will be anyone left to read his accounts. I have seen things that defy description, he tells you, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Fathers abandoning sick children, mothers fleeing from their dying infants. The bonds that hold society together have snapped like overstretched rope. His eyes hold the haunted look common to all plague survivors, the expression of someone who has witnessed hell and somehow lived to tell about it. The city's famous banking houses, Bardi, Peruzzi, Acciaiuoli, have either collapsed or operate with skeleton crews. The sophisticated financial instruments that Florentine bankers developed to facilitate international trade have become meaningless when there are too few merchants left alive to use them. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, partnership contracts, all the innovations that made Florence the financial capital of Europe have been rendered obsolete by mass death. The social structure that defined Florentine life has inverted completely. Noble families that ruled for generations have been extinguished entirely. The Guelph and Ghibelline factions that once dominated political life can barely muster enough living members to continue their ancient feuds. Power has shifted to whoever can organise the basic necessities of survival: food distribution, body disposal, rudimentary law enforcement. You witness a scene that encapsulates the collapse when you observe the attempts to continue the city's famous paleo horse race. Traditionally, the race involved elaborate pageantry, with each quarter of the city represented by magnificently dressed riders and horses. This year, only 3 horses showed up, ridden by men whose families had never been wealthy enough to participate before. The crowd consisted of perhaps 50 people, a pathetic remnant of the thousands who once filled the piazza for the celebration. The artistic workshops that made Florence synonymous with beauty have fallen silent. Painters' studios stand empty, their apprentices dead, their masters either fled or buried in mass graves. The tradition of artistic training that passed skills from master to student across generations has been broken. The techniques for mixing certain pigments, for achieving particular effects with light and shadow, have died with their practitioners. Even the city's physical beauty has begun to decay. Buildings go unrepaired when their owners die. Gardens become overgrown when there's no one left to tend them. The careful civic planning that made Florence a model for urban design has given way to practical concerns about body disposal and basic sanitation. Beauty has become a luxury that the living can't afford. The religious life that once provided the framework for Florentine society has been traumatized beyond recognition. The monastery of San Marco has lost most of its brothers to the plague. The surviving friars speak of spiritual crisis. How can God permit such suffering among the faithful? Why do prayer and penance seem to offer no protection against the pestilence? The certainties of medieval Christianity have been shaken to their foundations. Florence, which began the 14th century as the most sophisticated city in Europe, ends 1349 as a shadow of its former self. Of its 100,000 inhabitants, perhaps 25,000 remain alive. The cultural innovations that were beginning to transform European thought, humanism, artistic realism, banking sophistication, have been stopped cold by the simple biological fact that human creativity requires living humans. The Renaissance that should have begun in Florence will now have to wait for a new generation of survivors to rebuild from the ashes of the old world. You're walking through what was once the prosperous manor of Wistrington in the English Midlands, and the silence is so complete it makes your ears ring. It's September 1349, and you're a royal surveyor sent to document the plague's impact on the countryside. What you find here will be repeated across thousands of rural communities throughout Europe. The complete collapse of the agricultural system that has fed civilization for 1,000 years. The harvest rots in the fields. Wheat that should have been cut weeks ago stands brown and brittle, its grain falling to earth to feed only the rats and birds. Barley lies flattened by autumn rains never to be gathered. The apple orchards that once provided winter stores for the manor hang heavy with fruit that no one will pick. The sight is both beautiful and terrifying. nature reclaiming human settlements with startling speed. You approach the manor house, a substantial stone structure that once housed Lord William de Wistrington and his family. The Great Hall's windows are dark, its doors hanging open to the weather. Inside you find the remnants of the final feast, dishes still on the table, covered now with months of dust and decay. The family died here, along with most of their servants sometime during the summer plague season. The village beyond the manor tells an even grimmer story. Wistrington once supported 300 souls, peasant families who worked the Lord's domain and their own small plots. Now you count perhaps 20 survivors, mostly children orphaned by the plague and elderly people who somehow proved resistant to the disease. The rest lie in the churchyard, buried in mass graves when individual burials became impossible. Thomas Carpenter, one of the few adult survivors, explains what happened. It came with the harvest workers, he tells you, his voice hollow with trauma. Seasonal labourers from the Welsh borderlands looking for work. They brought the sickness with them. Within 2 weeks, the disease had spread through the crowded workers' quarters and into the village proper. Families that had lived here for generations died within days of each other. The economic implications are staggering. Medieval agriculture depends on intensive human labour. Ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting all require numerous workers coordinating their efforts. When the population drops by 60 or 70%, the entire system collapses. Fields that took centuries to clear and improve revert to wilderness within a single growing season. The feudal system, the social structure that has organised rural Europe for centuries, has simply ceased to function. The elaborate hierarchy of lords, bailiffs, reeves and villeins depended on population density that no longer exists. With most peasant families dead, the surviving serfs find themselves in unprecedented positions of power. They can demand higher wages, better working conditions, or simply abandon their traditional obligations and seek better opportunities elsewhere. You document the livestock situation with growing alarm. Cattle wander freely through village streets, their owners dead, no one left to milk them or prepare them for winter feeding. Sheep that represent years of careful breeding have been scattered by wolves and wild dogs, their bloodlines lost. Pigs root through abandoned gardens, destroying what little food production continues. The village church stands empty except for your footsteps echoing off stone walls. Father Benedict died in July, along with most of his parishioners. The surviving villagers haven't seen another priest in months. The bishop's messenger system collapsed when too many clerics died. Sunday services have become informal gatherings where survivors read prayers from memory, if they can read at all. The impact on food production will echo through the centuries. Without human management, carefully maintained drainage systems are already beginning to fail. Fields that took generations to clear of stones and roots are becoming overgrown. The accumulated agricultural knowledge, which crops grow best in particular soils, how to rotate fields for maximum productivity, when to plant and harvest for optimal yield, dies with the experienced farmers. You encounter similar scenes at every manor on your route. At Thornbury, the entire village is empty. Not a single survivor remains. The houses stand like tombstones in the landscape, their thatched roofs beginning to sag, their gardens reverting to wilderness. At Bradmere you find 3 old women caring for a dozen orphaned children, trying to maintain some semblance of community life, while having no idea how to manage the agricultural cycle that sustains them. The social revolution is already beginning. At Eastwood you meet Robert Fletcher, a former villain who has claimed his dead lord's manor house. "Who's to stop me?" he asks with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "The lord's dead. His sons are dead. His bailiff is dead. Someone needs to organise the harvest, or we'll all starve come winter." He's not wrong. Traditional authority has simply evaporated, leaving pragmatic necessity to determine new social arrangements. The breeding programs that created specialised livestock over centuries have been destroyed. The heavy horses needed for ploughing, the dairy cattle selected for milk production, the sheep bred for particular wool qualities. These genetic achievements represent hundreds of years of careful selection, and they're disappearing as rapidly as their human caretakers. Weather patterns seem to mock the agricultural crisis. 1349 is actually a good growing year in most of Europe. Adequate rainfall, moderate temperatures, favourable conditions that should have produced abundant harvests. Instead, the crops rot in the fields, while survivors struggle to maintain even subsistence level, production. It's a particularly cruel irony that nature provides abundance precisely when humanity lacks the workforce to take advantage of it. The forest boundaries that took centuries to establish are already blurring. Without human pressure to maintain agricultural land, the woodlands begin expanding back into cleared areas. Deer and wild boar become bolder, venturing into abandoned villages to forage. The careful balance between human settlement and natural landscape that characterized medieval Europe is shifting rapidly toward the wild. Children who survive the plague often have no adults left to teach them essential agricultural skills. You find orphans who can't distinguish between edible and poisonous plants, who don't know when to plant different crops, who have never learned to preserve food for winter storage. The knowledge that sustained rural communities for generations is being lost as rapidly as the people who possessed it. The tax system that funded medieval kingdoms has collapsed in rural areas. There are simply too few people left to collect taxes from, and those who survive often have nothing left to give. Royal officials who once extracted regular payments from hundreds of villages now find empty settlements or communities too depleted to provide any revenue. As you complete your survey of this devastated landscape, the full magnitude of the agricultural crisis becomes clear. The plague hasn't just killed people, it's destroyed the entire rural foundation upon which European civilization rested. Recovery will require not just population replacement, but the reconstruction of agricultural knowledge, social systems, and economic relationships that took centuries to develop. It's spring 1350, and you're standing in what was once the carefully ordered world of the Manor of Blackmere, watching the feudal system die in real time. As steward to the Earl of Pembroke, you've spent your career managing the complex relationships between lords and peasants that have structured rural society for centuries. But the plague has shattered those relationships as completely as if they were made of glass. The surviving peasants gather in the manor hall not as supplicants seeking their lord's favour, but as equals negotiating new terms of employment. The dynamic is so foreign to traditional feudal relationships that it leaves you speechless. These are men and women whose grandfathers would have been beaten for speaking directly to a lord's representative, now demanding wages, shorter working hours, and the right to leave the manor if they find better conditions elsewhere. "We'll work the domain," announces John Miller, a surviving villain whose family has been bound to this land for 7 generations, but not for the old terms. "We want coin payment, not labour service, and we want permission to work for others during harvest season." The audacity would have been unthinkable before the plague, when peasants were legally bound to the soil and forbidden from seeking employment elsewhere. The mathematics of survival have made their demands irrefutable. Where once 200 peasant families worked the manor's 2,000 acres, only 40 remain alive. Those survivors can dictate terms because without their labour, the entire estate becomes worthless. The lord needs them far more than they need him. Traditional feudal obligations, labour service, military duty, payment in kind, have become meaningless when there aren't enough people to fulfil them. You witness the transformation most clearly in the abandoned villages scattered across the manor. Westfield, which once housed 50 families, now contains only wind and weeds. The houses stand empty, their timber frames beginning to rot, their gardens overgrown with brambles. The careful strip farming that characterised medieval agriculture, long, narrow fields allocated to individual peasant families, has given way to vast empty spaces that no one claims or works. The legal system that enforced feudal obligations has simply ceased to function. The manor court, which once met monthly to resolve disputes and punish infractions, hasn't convened in 8 months. There are too few people left to serve as jurors, and most of the traditional offences, poaching, unauthorised marriage, leaving the manor without permission, have become academic when there's no population left to commit them. Sarah Baker, one of the surviving peasant women, exemplifies the social revolution taking place. Before the plague, she was bound to her husband's village, forbidden from owning property or travelling without permission. Now, with her husband and children dead and her village largely empty, she's claimed an abandoned farm 3 miles away and demands recognition of her ownership. "Who's to stop me?" she asks with fierce pragmatism. "The land needs working, and I need land to work." The relationship between military service and land tenure, fundamental to feudal society, has collapsed entirely. The lord's obligation to provide trained knights for the king's army cannot be fulfilled when there aren't enough healthy men left alive. The peasant's traditional duty to serve as foot soldiers has become meaningless, when most villagers can't muster even a handful of able-bodied men. Economic relationships that took centuries to develop have been reversed overnight. Before the plague, landlords could dictate terms to peasants, because land was limited and labour was abundant. Now labour has become the scarce resource, while vast tracts of land sit empty. Surviving peasants find themselves in the unprecedented position of being able to choose their landlords rather than being chosen by them. The manorial system's careful regulation of rural life has broken down completely. The bailiff who once supervised daily agricultural work is dead. The reeve who organised communal labour has died. The miller who processed grain for the entire community lies buried in the churchyard. These weren't just jobs, they were specialised roles that required years of training and local knowledge, all now lost. You document scene after scene of social inversion. At the village of Millbrook, a former peasant named Richard Ploughman has moved into the manor house, claiming it by right of occupancy since the lord's family died without heirs. He's organising the surviving villagers not as a feudal lord commanding obedience, but as an elected leader coordinating voluntary cooperation. The transformation represents a fundamental shift from hierarchical authority to democratic organisation. The complex web of feudal obligations that once governed rural relationships has been replaced by simple cash transactions. Instead of providing 3 days of labour service per week, peasants now work for daily wages. Instead of paying rent in grain and livestock, they offer money. The personal bonds that connected lord and peasant across generations have been severed, replaced by impersonal economic relationships. The decline of the manor system has created massive population movements as survivors seek better opportunities elsewhere. Villages that were once stable communities for centuries now see their remaining inhabitants leaving for towns, other manors, or entirely new regions. The geographical stability that characterised medieval rural life has given way to unprecedented mobility. The specialised agricultural knowledge that sustained manor-based farming is disappearing with alarming speed. The techniques for managing crop rotation across large estates, the breeding programs that produce specialised livestock, the coordination of seasonal labour across multiple villages, all require population densities and social structures that no longer exist. Religious life, which once provided the moral framework for feudal relationships, offers no guidance for the new social realities. The priest who might have counselled patience and acceptance of traditional hierarchies is dead. The bishop who could have provided authoritative interpretation of social obligations has fled. Surviving peasants must navigate unprecedented social freedom without traditional moral guidelines. The transformation isn't uniformly liberating for survivors. Many elderly peasants, accustomed to the security of traditional feudal relationships, find themselves terrified by their new freedom. They've lived their entire lives within carefully structured social roles and don't know how to function as independent economic actors. The collapse of feudalism brings opportunity for some, but confusion and anxiety for others. As you complete your documentation of this revolutionary transformation, the broader implications become clear. The plague hasn't just changed the demographics of rural Europe, it's destroyed the social and economic system that organised medieval life. The feudalism that emerged in the Dark Ages and structured European society for 500 years is dying as surely as the people who sustained it. What emerges from this rural revolution will fundamentally reshape European civilization. By winter 1350, you're witnessing something unprecedented in European history, the birth of rural democracy. As a travelling magistrate attempting to restore royal authority in the plague-devastated countryside, you're discovering that traditional governance has been replaced by spontaneous forms of self-organisation that would have been unthinkable before the Great Dying. The village of Thornwick, which you're visiting on this grey December morning, exemplifies the transformation. Once a typical feudal manor with 300 inhabitants organised under strict hierarchical authority, it now houses 80 survivors who have created entirely new forms of social organisation. They meet weekly in the church to make collective decisions about land use, resource allocation and community governance, not because any lord commands it, but because survival demands cooperation. "We vote on everything now," explains Mary Shepherd. a middle-aged woman who has somehow become the community's de facto leader. Before the plague, she would never have been allowed to speak in any official capacity. Women had no formal role in feudal governance. Now she chairs the weekly meetings and coordinates work assignments, with authority that comes from competence rather than birth or gender. Someone must decide which fields to plant, which houses to repair, how to divide the harvest. We do it together, or we don't do it at all. The economic arrangements emerging in these surviving communities represent a radical departure from feudal practice. Instead of individual peasant families working assigned strips of land under a lord's supervision, the survivors have organised collective farming operations. They work the best remaining fields together, sharing both labour and harvest according to formulas they've developed through trial and negotiation. At Thornwick, you observe a typical workday under this new system. 20 adults head out to the wheat field together, their children playing nearby while the adults work. They take turns with the heaviest labour, share tools collectively, and stop for communal meals prepared by whoever isn't needed in the fields that day. It's a form of agricultural organisation that combines efficiency with social solidarity in ways the old manorial system never achieved. The legal innovations are equally striking. Without lords' courts to resolve disputes, the surviving communities have developed their own systems of justice. At Elmwood, you witness a judgment by neighbours, where the entire adult population hears a dispute between two families over rights to an abandoned house. After hearing both sides, they vote on a solution that splits the difference. The house goes to one family, but they must provide winter shelter for the other family's elderly mother. Property relationships have been revolutionised by simple demographic reality. With most families dead, the traditional inheritance patterns that govern medieval land tenure have become meaningless. Empty farms are simply claimed by whoever can work them, regardless of previous ownership or family connection. The survivors have developed informal but effective systems for allocating resources based on need and capability rather than legal precedent. The breakdown of traditional authority has accelerated innovation in agricultural technique. Without the conservative influence of feudal lords who insisted on maintaining traditional practices, surviving peasants experiment with new crops, different field arrangements, and novel approaches to animal husbandry. At Westbrook, you find them trying to grow wine grapes in fields previously reserved for grain, an experiment that would have been forbidden under the old system, but might prove economically beneficial. Social mobility has become not just possible but inevitable. Children orphaned by the plague find themselves raised by whatever adults survived, regardless of previous social status. A blacksmith's daughter might be cared for by a former serf's family, learning agricultural skills that would have been forbidden to her original social class. The rigid class boundaries that defined medieval society are dissolving through sheer practical necessity. The religious innovations are equally dramatic. Without priests to conduct official services, the communities have developed their own forms of worship. At Millbridge, you observe a Sunday gathering where surviving villagers take turns reading from the Bible, leading prayers, and discussing moral questions that arise in their daily lives. They've created a form of democratic Christianity that would have been heretical before the plague, but seems natural to people who've been forced to organise every other aspect of their lives collectively. Educational arrangements have been transformed by necessity. The few adults who can read now teach anyone who wants to learn, regardless of age or social background. Children who would never have been allowed access to literacy under the feudal system receive instruction alongside adults who recognise that knowledge must be preserved and transmitted if the community is to survive. The surviving communities have developed sophisticated systems for dealing with outsiders, refugees from other devastated areas, bandits attracted by undefended settlements, royal officials attempting to reimpose traditional authority. At Blackwater, you find they've organised a militia that combines former knights, surviving peasants, and even women into an effective defence force that successfully repelled a bandit attack last month. Resource management has become a community responsibility handled through democratic deliberation. Decisions about which buildings to maintain, which fields to plant, how to allocate scarce materials like iron and salt are made through collective discussion rather than feudal command. The process is slower than traditional top-down management, but produces decisions that have broader community support. The psychological transformation may be the most profound change of all. Peasants who lived their entire lives, accepting the authority of social superiors, now speak with confidence about their own capabilities and rights. The plague has forced them to take responsibility for decisions previously made by lords, bailiffs and reeves, and they've discovered they're quite capable of self-governance. Marriage and family arrangements have adapted to the new demographics. With traditional courtship patterns disrupted by mass death, the survivors have developed more flexible approaches to partnership and child-rearing. Community members often share responsibility for orphaned children, and marriage arrangements focus more on practical compatibility than on traditional considerations of property and social status. The communities are beginning to develop inter-village networks for trade, mutual defence, and shared resources. Representatives from different surviving settlements meet to coordinate planting schedules, share information about bandit movements, and arrange marriages between young people from different communities. These horizontal relationships replace the vertical feudal hierarchies that once organised rural life. As you document these revolutionary changes, their historical significance becomes clear. The plague has accidentally created the conditions for social experiments that were impossible under the old system. The rural democracy emerging from the ashes of feudalism will eventually influence urban governance, challenge royal authority, and contribute to the political revolutions that will transform Europe in coming centuries. The Great Dying has ended, but the Great Transformation has only just begun. You're standing in the main square of Strasbourg on a grey October morning in 1349, watching 400 half-naked people beat themselves bloody while chanting prayers in languages you don't recognise. As a merchant travelling through the plague-devastated regions of the Holy Roman Empire, you've seen madness take many forms, but nothing prepared you for the spectacle of the flagellant movement, Christianity turned inside out by desperation and terror. The procession enters the square with a sound like rain on leaves, hundreds of leather whips striking human flesh in synchronised rhythm. Men, women, even children as young as 12 march in formation, their backs crisscrossed with bleeding wounds that never fully heal because they're reopened daily through ritual self-torture. Their leader, a gaunt man who calls himself Brother Klaus, though you doubt that's his birth name, raises his scourge high above his head and brings it down across his shoulders with such force that droplets of blood spray across the cobblestones. "Peccavi! Peccavi!" they chant in Latin. "I have sinned! I have sinned!" The words echo off the half-empty buildings surrounding the square, many shops closed forever, their owners either dead or fled. The flagellants believe that human sin has brought the plague as divine punishment, and that sufficient penance might convince God to lift his wrath from the earth. They've been travelling from town to town for months, leaving trails of blood and religious fervour across plague-ravaged Europe. The theology is simple and terrifying in its logic. If God is punishing humanity for its wickedness, then humans must punish themselves even more severely to demonstrate their repentance. The flagellants have developed elaborate rituals around this self-imposed suffering. They strip to the waist regardless of weather, exposing scarred and mutilated flesh to the elements. They sleep on the bare ground, eat only bread and water, and maintain complete silence except during their bloody ceremonies. Brother Klaus approaches you directly, his eyes burning with the fevered certainty of fanaticism. His German is heavily accented. You think he might originally be from the Low Countries, another refugee from devastation seeking meaning through pain. "Join us, brother merchant," he says, his voice hoarse from shouting prayers. "Your gold cannot save you from God's wrath. Only blood can wash away the sins that brought this pestilence upon the world." The psychological appeal is undeniable. In a world where traditional religious authority has failed spectacularly, where priests die at the same rate as sinners, where prayer and penance seem to offer no protection against the plague, the flagellants offer direct action, visible penance, the illusion that human suffering might influence divine will. They promise agency in a situation where people feel completely powerless. The movement has developed its own internal hierarchy and theology that directly challenges church authority. The flagellants claim divine revelation that bypasses traditional clerical mediation. Brother Klaus insists he receives visions directly from Christ, instructions for new forms of penance that the corrupt institutional church has failed to develop. This theological rebellion is as dangerous to established authority as any political revolution. The social revolution embedded in the flagellant movement is as significant as its religious innovation. Traditional class distinctions dissolve in the brotherhood of blood. You observe noblemen and peasants whipping themselves with equal fervour, their social ranks temporarily irrelevant in the face of shared penance. Women assume leadership roles that would be impossible in normal church hierarchy. The movement offers a form of egalitarian spirituality that directly challenges the feudal order. But the flagellant's theology leads inevitably to scapegoating. If human sin caused the plague, then identifying and punishing the worst sinners might help end it. Brother Klaus's afternoon sermon focuses increasingly on the Jews, whom he accuses of poisoning wells, practicing demonic magic, and corrupting Christian souls through usury and trade. The crowd's religious fervour gradually transforms into something darker and more dangerous. "The Christ killers walk among us still," Klaus shouts, his voice rising to match the intensity of his self-flagellation. "They mock our suffering while they spread their plague poison through our communities." The theological leap from self-punishment to persecution of others happens with terrifying speed. Religious enthusiasm becomes the justification for racial violence. You witnessed the results of this rhetoric the following evening. A mob of flagellants and local citizens attacks the Jewish quarter, dragging families from their homes while shouting prayers and accusations. The irony is lost on the attackers. Jewish families are dying of plague at the same rate as Christians, obvious proof that they're not responsible for the disease. But logical evidence means nothing to people desperate for someone to blame for incomprehensible catastrophe. The violence escalates with religious justification. The synagogue is burned while the attackers sing hymns. Jewish children are baptized by force while their parents are murdered, creating Christian orphans who will never know their original heritage. The flagellants frame every atrocity as divine service, every murder as holy sacrifice necessary to appease God's wrath. The movement's approach to death itself represents a fundamental departure from traditional Christian teaching. Instead of fearing plague as divine punishment, the flagellants begin to welcome it as divine favour, a sign that their penance has been accepted and they're being called directly to heaven. Some actively seek exposure to plague victims, believing that dying of the pestilence while engaged in religious penance guarantees immediate salvation. This death-seeking spirituality produces behaviours that accelerate the plague's spread. Flagellant processions move from town to town, carrying infection along with their religious message. Their communal sleeping arrangements, shared food, and close physical contact during ceremonies create perfect conditions for disease transmission. They become inadvertent agents of the very catastrophe they're trying to end through religious devotion. The church hierarchy's response to the flagellant movement reveals the institutional crisis plaguing medieval Christianity. Pope Clement VI has condemned the movement as heretical, but his authority carries little weight when local priests are either dead or have joined the flagellants themselves. The normal mechanisms of religious authority, episcopal oversight, clerical education, theological disputation, have been disrupted by the plague just as thoroughly as secular governance. The psychological profiles of flagellant leaders reveal the movement's deeper dynamics. Many are displaced persons, refugees from plague-devastated regions who've lost family, property, social position, and traditional identity. Religious extremism provides both explanation for their suffering and a new form of social organisation to replace what they've lost. The movement offers traumatized individuals a sense of purpose and community in a world that seems to have abandoned both. As you prepare to leave Strasbourg, having concluded your business with the few surviving merchants, you understand that you've witnessed more than religious hysteria. The flagellant movement represents medieval Christianity's attempt to make sense of incomprehensible catastrophe, but its solutions, extreme penance, scapegoating, death-seeking, are as destructive as the plague itself. Faith has been twisted into fanaticism by the pressure of mass death and social collapse. The procession continues down the road toward the next town, leaving behind a Jewish quarter reduced to ashes and a Christian community that has turned religious devotion into justification for atrocity. December 1349 finds you in the ruins of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, once one of the most powerful monasteries in France. now reduced to fewer than a dozen surviving brothers attempting to maintain religious observances in buildings that echo with emptiness. As a papal legate investigating the Church's response to the plague crisis, you're documenting not just physical devastation, but the complete collapse of medieval Christianity's theological certainties. Brother Augustine, the acting abbot since his superior died in July, leads you through corridors that once housed 200 monks. The silence is oppressive, not the contemplative quiet of traditional monastic life, but the hollow emptiness of extinction. Most of the cells stand open and abandoned, their occupants dead, their personal possessions scattered or stolen. The great library, once containing thousands of manuscripts representing centuries of accumulated theological wisdom, sits largely unattended because there aren't enough literate brothers left to maintain the collection. We held our faith, Brother Augustine tells you as you walk through the empty refectory, his voice barely above a whisper. We prayed without ceasing, fasted until our bodies failed, spent days prostrate before the altar begging for divine intervention. God remained silent while our brothers died one by one. The anguish in his words reflects a spiritual crisis that extends far beyond this single monastery. Medieval Christianity's fundamental assumptions about divine justice and earthly suffering have been shattered by the plague's random cruelty. The theological questions tormenting the surviving clergy cut to the heart of Christian doctrine. If God is just and merciful, why did the plague kill devout monks at the same rate as notorious sinners? Why did prayers and penance offer no protection against disease? Why did some communities that embraced flagellation and extreme religious devotion suffer just as severely as those that continued normal religious observances? The plague has created a crisis of faith that challenges every assumption about divine providence and human righteousness. You examine the monastery's records of the plague months, maintained with pathetic precision by brothers who continued their administrative duties even as their community died around them. The entries become increasingly desperate as the death toll mounts. Brother Francis called to God. Brother Thomas taken by the pestilence. Brother Peter died in great agony. By autumn, the handwriting becomes shaky, the entries shorter, until finally they stop altogether when no one remained capable of maintaining the chronicle. The economic collapse has been as devastating as the human losses. The monastery's extensive land holdings, once worked by tenant farmers who paid rent in grain and labour, now lie largely empty. The complex network of agricultural estates, mills, fisheries and workshops that sustained monastic life for centuries has disintegrated. The surviving brothers lack both the manpower and the knowledge to maintain these economic relationships. Many were scholars, not agricultural administrators. The impact on religious education represents an incalculable cultural loss. Saint-Denis once operated a renowned school where young men from across Europe came to study theology, philosophy and letters. The plague has ended centuries of continuous scholarly tradition in a matter of months. The teaching brothers are dead. The student dormitories stand empty. The careful system of academic progression from novice to master has been broken beyond repair. You discover theological manuscripts left unfinished when their authors died, commentaries on Aristotle that break off mid-sentence, biblical interpretations that will never be completed, philosophical treatises that end abruptly when their authors succumb to the plague. These incomplete works represent not just individual tragedies, but the interruption of intellectual traditions that stretched back to the early Church Fathers. The crisis of clerical authority has created unprecedented theological chaos. With bishops dead or fled, surviving priests make their own interpretations of church doctrine. Some have joined the flagellant movement, abandoning traditional liturgy for extreme penance. Others have embraced mystical visions that bypass official church teaching. The unified theological voice that once defined medieval Christianity has fractured into competing interpretations of divine will and human suffering. You interview Brother Michael, one of the few monks who actually contracted the plague and survived. His account challenges every assumption about divine providence and earthly suffering. I lay dying for 6 days, calling upon Christ for deliverance. My fever reached such heights that I saw visions of hell itself, demons dancing among plague victims, Satan laughing at human prayers. Yet somehow I recovered while Brother Francis, the most pious man I ever knew, died in agony despite his perfect faith. The monastery's chapel tells its own story of theological crisis. The altar where daily masses once celebrated Christ's victory over death now seems to mock that triumph. The stone walls that witness centuries of confident prayer now echo with uncertainty and doubt. The stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes of divine intervention illuminate a reality where God seems conspicuously absent from human suffering. The economic crisis facing the church extends far beyond individual monasteries. The entire system of religious funding, donations, tithes, land holdings, trade investments has collapsed along with the population that sustained it. Cathedral construction projects that began decades ago stand incomplete, their scaffolding rotting in the weather, their stone blocks scattered like abandoned toys. The great building campaigns that created Gothic Christianity's architectural monuments have ended not through completion, but through extinction. You examine the monastery's correspondence with other religious houses, a network of letters that once connected Christian communities across Europe. The final messages paint a picture of universal devastation. All our brothers have perished save 3. The pestilence has claimed our abbot and librarian. We can no longer maintain daily offices. The letters become increasingly brief and desperate before stopping entirely as their authors join the ranks of the dead. The impact on Christian scholarship represents a catastrophe whose effects will echo through the centuries. The careful system of copying and preserving manuscripts that maintained classical knowledge through the Dark Ages has broken down. Libraries sit unattended while their contents decay. The oral traditions of theological interpretation die with the masters who possessed them. Centuries of accumulated Christian learning vanishes as surely as if it had been deliberately destroyed by invading armies. The plague has created new forms of popular religiosity that bypass traditional church authority entirely. Surviving communities develop their own interpretations of Scripture, their own forms of worship, their own explanations for divine silence in the face of mass death. Some embrace extreme asceticism, believing that traditional Christianity was insufficiently rigorous to prevent God's wrath. Others turn toward mysticism, seeking direct personal revelation to replace the failed mediation of corrupt clergy. The psychological trauma affecting surviving clergy manifests in various forms of spiritual pathology. Some become obsessed with apocalyptic prophecy, convinced that the plague represents the beginning of the end times described in Revelation. Others retreat into complete contemplative silence, unable to find words for experiences that seem to transcend human understanding. Still others abandon religious life entirely, their faith shattered by witnessing God's apparent indifference to human suffering. You discover evidence of theological innovation born from desperation. Surviving clerics develop new prayers specifically for plague victims, new explanations for divine silence, new theories about the relationship between sin and suffering. These theological innovations often contradict established church doctrine, but there's no institutional authority left to suppress them. The plague has accidentally created space for religious experimentation that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The monastery's cemetery tells the final story of faith confronted by inexplicable suffering. The carefully maintained graves of generations of monks give way to mass burial pits, where dozens of brothers lie in unmarked ground. The elaborate funeral rites that once celebrated the Christian hope of resurrection have been abandoned for practical mass disposal of corpses. Even in death, the plague has stripped away the theological certainties that once made mortality bearable. Brother Augustine leads you to the monastery's most precious relic, a fragment of the true cross that has been venerated for centuries as a source of miraculous healing. The irony is inescapable. This sacred object, supposedly imbued with Christ's power over death, provided no protection against the plague. Brothers who spent hours in prayer before the relic died at the same rate as those who ignored it entirely. As you prepare your report for the Pope, the magnitude of Christianity's institutional crisis becomes clear. The plague hasn't just killed individual believers, it has shattered the theological framework that made medieval Christianity intellectually and emotionally sustainable. The survivors face not just the challenge of rebuilding religious institutions, but of reconstructing faith itself in the face of apparently random divine cruelty. The great silence that has descended upon monasteries like Saint-Denis echoes across all of Christian Europe, a quiet that speaks more eloquently than any theological treatise about the collapse of medieval religious certainty. March, 1351 finds you in the German city of Mainz, investigating reports of religious movements that have emerged from the plague's devastation like strange flowers blooming in cemetery soil. As an inquisitor for the church, you're tasked with distinguishing between acceptable expressions of popular piety and dangerous departures from orthodox doctrine. What you discover challenges every assumption about how extreme circumstances affect religious belief. The sect, calling itself the Brothers and Sisters of Free Spirit, has taken root in the ruins of what was once a prosperous merchant quarter. Their leader, a woman named Marguerite who claims direct communication with the Holy Spirit, holds court in an abandoned church where traditional Christian symbols have been rearranged into patterns you don't recognize. The plague has created space for religious experimentation that would have been ruthlessly suppressed under normal circumstances when church authority was strong and populations were stable. Christ spoke to me during the Great Dying, Marguerite tells the assembled followers, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has seen visions that others can only imagine. He revealed that the plague was not punishment but purification, a burning away of false religion to make room for direct spiritual experience. Her theology is a radical departure from Orthodox Christianity, eliminating the need for clerical mediation, institutional authority, and even traditional moral constraints. The group's practices exemplify the religious revolution taking place across plague-devastated Europe. They share all property in common, having abandoned the concept of individual ownership as a barrier to spiritual development. They practice ritual nudity during their religious ceremonies, claiming that clothing represents the artificial distinctions that separate humans from divine truth. Most dangerously from the Church's perspective, they deny the necessity of traditional sacraments, insisting that direct spiritual experience makes institutional religion obsolete. You observe a typical gathering of the Free Spirit community, and understand why church authorities find them so threatening. Men and women participate equally in religious discussions that would have been restricted to ordained clergy in normal times. Children as young as 10 offer theological interpretations that contradict established doctrine with confidence that suggest they've never been taught to defer to clerical authority. The social hierarchy that structures traditional Christianity has been completely inverted. Their economic arrangements challenge every assumption about property and social organisation. The community owns everything collectively: houses, workshops, agricultural tools, even clothing can be shared among members according to need rather than individual ownership. This Christian communism isn't just economic pragmatism in the face of reduced population, but theological conviction that private property represents spiritual attachment that prevents union with the divine. The psychological appeal of such radical theology becomes clear when you interview individual members. Anna, a widow who lost her entire family to the plague, explains, "The old church promised that suffering would be rewarded in heaven, but offered no comfort while my children died in agony. Here, I find God's presence immediately, without waiting for death or depending on priests who couldn't save themselves from the pestilence." The Free Spirit movement's approach to death itself reflects their complete departure from traditional Christianity. Instead of fearing mortality or seeking to avoid it through prayer and good works, they welcome death as the ultimate spiritual experience, direct union with the divine that makes earthly existence seem like a preliminary stage of consciousness. This death-embracing spirituality produces behaviour that seems almost suicidal to Orthodox Christians, but represents logical consistency to true believers. You document similar movements throughout the plague-affected regions, each developing unique theological innovations that would have been impossible under normal church authority. The Brethren of Joy in Frankfurt practice continuous celebration, believing that happiness itself is divine worship that honours God better than traditional penance and solemnity. The Children of the New Covenant in Prague have abandoned all Christian symbols and developed entirely original rituals based on visions experienced during plague-induced delirium. The most dangerous aspect of these movements from the Church's perspective is their systematic rejection of institutional authority. They don't simply interpret doctrine differently. They deny that doctrine itself has any relevance to authentic spiritual experience. They claim direct revelation that bypasses scripture, tradition, and clerical teaching entirely. This represents not just heresy, but a complete alternative to medieval Christianity's institutional structure. The social composition of these heretical movements reveals patterns that extend across all plague-affected regions. Members are predominantly survivors who lost families, property and social position to the pestilence. They're drawn from all social classes, former nobles who lost their estates, craftsmen whose guilds dissolved, clergy whose monasteries emptied, united by shared trauma rather than traditional social bonds. The theological sophistication of these movements surprises you, despite their radical departures from orthodoxy. Marguerite demonstrates extensive knowledge of scripture and church history, using them to support arguments against the very institutional Christianity that preserved and transmitted them. The heretics aren't ignorant of traditional theology. They've consciously rejected it after careful consideration of alternatives that the plague made thinkable. The geographic spread of these movements follows the plague's path almost exactly, suggesting that extreme demographic trauma creates psychological conditions favourable to radical religious innovation. Communities that suffered the highest death rates show the most dramatic departures from Orthodox Christianity, while areas that escaped the worst devastation maintain more traditional religious practices. Your investigation reveals the fundamental challenge these movements pose to church authority. They're not simply preaching false doctrine that can be corrected through education and persuasion. They've developed complete alternative systems of religious meaning that make institutional Christianity seem irrelevant to human spiritual needs. They represent not just heresy, but the possibility of post-Christian religion emerging from Christianity's own cultural matrix. As you compile your report for church authorities, the implications become clear. The plague has created not just institutional crisis for medieval Christianity, but ideological crisis that challenges the entire framework of traditional religious belief. The heretical movements emerging from demographic catastrophe represent permanent alternatives to Orthodox Christianity that will influence religious development for centuries to come. The brothers and sisters of free spirit continue their unconventional worship as you depart Mainz, their voices raised in songs that sound nothing like traditional hymns, celebrating a God who speaks directly to human hearts without requiring institutional mediation. It's April 1350, and you're standing in what was once the bustling wool market of Bruges, the commercial heart of Northern Europe, watching the collapse of an economic system that took centuries to develop. As a Venetian merchant who has built your fortune on the complex networks of international trade, you're witnessing the death of medieval capitalism in real time. The plague hasn't just killed people, it's destroyed the human relationships that made commerce possible. The Great Cloth Hall, normally filled with merchants from England, France, Italy and the German states, now echoes with emptiness. Of the 200 stalls that once displayed the finest woolens in Europe, perhaps 30 remain active. The rest stand empty, their operators either dead or fled, their carefully cultivated trade relationships severed as permanently as if they'd been cut with a sword. The elaborate credit networks that financed international commerce have collapsed along with the merchants who created them. You examine your own account books with growing despair. Of the 47 business partners you worked with before the plague, only 11 remain alive. The rest are names in a ledger attached to debts that will never be collected and credits that will never be honoured. Giovanni Faglia, who owed you 500 ducats for a shipment of spices, died in Venice along with his entire family. His warehouse stands sealed by authorities, its contents rotting while lawyers who don't exist anymore argue over inheritance laws that no longer apply. The Medici Bank, once the financial backbone of European commerce, operates with a staff of 6 men instead of the 60 who managed its Bruges operations before the plague. Cosimo de' Medici himself barely survived the pestilence in Florence, and now oversees an empire of empty offices and uncollectible debts. The sophisticated letters of credit that once moved vast sums across continents without physical transport of gold have become worthless paper when the merchants who honoured them are dead. The currency itself tells the story of economic collapse. Gold and silver coins circulate freely now because there's no one left to spend them and nothing left to buy. The careful regulation of monetary policy by guilds and city-states has broken down when the authorities who enforced such rules lie in plague pits. In Ghent, you witnessed citizens literally shoveling silver coins into the street because bread was unobtainable at any price. The wool trade, the foundation of northern European prosperity, has suffered total disruption. English sheep still produce fleece, but the shepherds who tended them are largely dead. Flemish weavers who possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge about transforming raw wool into luxury cloth have taken their expertise to mass graves. The complex supply chains that moved wool from English hills to Flemish workshops to Italian markets have snapped at every link. You meet with Peter van Brugge, one of the few surviving wool merchants, in what was once a tavern filled with international traders. Now it's just the two of you sitting at a table meant for 20, discussing transactions that might never be completed. I have orders for 10,000 yards of scarlet cloth from merchants in Constantinople, he tells you with bitter irony. But no weavers to make it, no dyers to colour it, and no ships to transport it, even if I could produce it. The manufacturing crisis extends far beyond textiles. The armourer who forged the finest mail in Europe died along with his 3 apprentices, taking techniques passed down through 5 generations to the grave. The goldsmith whose jewellery graced noble courts across the continent lies buried in a mass grave outside Paris, his workshop sealed and his tools rusting. The accumulated technical knowledge that made European craftsmanship superior to competitors has vanished as rapidly as the craftsmen who possessed it. Credit relationships, the invisible bonds that held medieval commerce together, have dissolved completely. The trust that allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances without immediate payment depended on stable communities where reputation mattered and contracts could be enforced. When populations disappear and legal systems collapse, credit becomes impossible to maintain. Trade returns to simple barter between survivors who trust no one they can't see face to face. The great trading cities that dominated European commerce show the starkest evidence of economic collapse. Lübeck, once the mighty capital of the Hanseatic League, struggles to maintain trade connections with half its member cities simply gone, their merchant families extinct, their warehouses empty, their docks rotting. The complex network of commercial relationships that created the first truly international economy in human history has been severed by mass death. Agricultural commerce, the foundation of all other economic activity, faces complete reorganisation. The manorial system that organised rural production for centuries has collapsed, leaving no clear mechanism for moving surplus food from countryside to city. Markets that once efficiently distributed grain, meat and dairy products across hundreds of miles now operate sporadically when they operate at all. Urban survivors often find themselves with gold but no food, while rural survivors have surplus crops but no buyers. The psychological transformation of economic relationships may be the most profound change of all. Before the plague, commerce operated on assumptions of continuity, that partners would honour agreements, that currencies would retain value, that trade routes would remain stable over time. The plague has shattered these assumptions, creating a survivor mentality where immediate exchange is the only transaction anyone trusts. You witness scenes that would have been unimaginable before the plague. In Ghent's central square, a former silk merchant offers his entire remaining inventory, hundreds of yards of precious fabric from Damascus and Constantinople, in exchange for a single cart of grain. Noble families who once competed to display their wealth through conspicuous consumption now trade family heirlooms for basic necessities. The careful status distinctions maintained through economic display have been abandoned for pure survival economics. The insurance industry, just beginning to develop before the plague, has disappeared entirely. The calculation of risk that made commercial insurance possible assumed statistical predictability based on historical experience. The plague has made such calculations meaningless by creating risks that exceed any historical precedent. Ship owners, merchants, and manufacturers face dangers that can't be calculated or protected against through traditional financial instruments. As you prepare to return to Venice with whatever cargo you can assemble, the future of European commerce seems impossibly uncertain. The networks of trust, knowledge, and institutional support that made international trade possible have been destroyed as thoroughly as the cities that housed them. Recovery will require not just population replacement, but the complete reconstruction of commercial relationships that took centuries to develop. The great market halls of Bruges stand nearly empty as you depart, their silence testifying to the death of medieval Europe's first experiment with truly international capitalism. September 1351 finds you in the English countryside, documenting the most dramatic economic transformation in European history. As a royal commissioner investigating labour conditions after the plague, you're witnessing the collapse of feudal economics and the birth of something entirely new, a market economy where workers have power their ancestors could never have imagined. The Great Dying has accidentally created the first labour shortage in recorded history, and the survivors are using their scarcity as leverage to revolutionise economic relationships. At the Manor of Westbrook, you encounter a scene that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Thomas Miller, a former serf whose family was bound to this land for 7 generations, sits across a table from Sir Robert de Clare, negotiating the terms of his employment as if he were the Lord's equal. Thomas demands cash wages instead of labour service, the right to work for other employers during harvest season, and provision of a stone cottage instead of the traditional peasant hovel. "I can work your land, or I can work elsewhere," Thomas says with matter-of-fact confidence that reveals how completely the economic balance has shifted. Lord Geoffrey offers better terms, and the abbot at Thornbury promises housing for my family. Before the plague, such words would have resulted in imprisonment or worse. Now Sir Robert nods grimly and agrees to the demands, because without Thomas and the handful of other survivors, his estate becomes worthless. The mathematics of scarcity have revolutionised agricultural economics overnight. Where once 300 peasant families competed for the limited opportunities available on a typical manor, now 50 survivors can choose among multiple desperate landlords. The labour that was once essentially free, provided through feudal obligation, now commands wages that would have bankrupted lords in the pre-plague economy. A day's field work that once cost nothing but food now requires silver coins that many landowners don't possess. You document wage increases that seem impossible until you witness them firsthand. Agricultural labourers who earned 2 pence per day before the plague now demand 8 or 10 pence for the same work. Skilled craftsmen command prices that exceed their former annual incomes for single projects. A master carpenter who once served a single lord for life now travels from estate to estate, choosing his employers based on working conditions and compensation packages that include not just money, but housing, food allowances, and even entertainment provisions. The social revolution embedded in these economic changes extends far beyond simple wage increases. Peasant families that lived in single-room hovels for generations suddenly find themselves occupying manor houses abandoned by extinct noble families. Agricultural workers who never owned property beyond a few chickens claim entire farms simply by occupying and working them. The rigid social hierarchy that defined medieval England has been flattened by demographic catastrophe. At the village of Millham, you meet Sarah Baker, a widow who has assembled an economic empire that would have been impossible for any woman before the plague. She operates the village mill, manages grain storage for 3 surrounding communities, and has contracted to provide bread for the surviving garrison at nearby Thornwall Castle. "My husband ran the mill before he died," she explains. "Now I run the mill, the granary, and half the surviving farms in the district. Who's to stop me when there's no one else left to do the work?" The guild system that regulated crafts and trades for centuries has collapsed entirely in most regions. The elaborate apprenticeship programs, the careful control of production techniques, the restrictions on who could practice various trades, all have become meaningless when master craftsmen are dead and survivors need goods produced by anyone capable of making them. Former peasants learn metalworking, weaving, and other skilled trades simply by occupying abandoned workshops and experimenting with the tools they find there. The transformation affects every level of economic activity. In London, you find royal officials paying wages to street cleaners and ditch diggers that exceed the incomes of minor nobles before the plague. The city government has no choice. The alternative is streets filled with garbage and human waste that would make the urban environment uninhabitable for the survivors. Public works projects that were once accomplished through forced labour now require competitive bidding among contractors who can charge whatever the market will bear. The rental market has inverted completely. Landlords who once commanded high rents for marginal properties now offer substantial payments to tenants willing to occupy and maintain buildings that would otherwise deteriorate. In York, you document cases of property owners paying families to live in houses rent-free, simply to prevent the buildings from falling into complete decay. The economic relationships that defined urban life for centuries have been turned upside down by simple supply and demand. Currency circulation patterns reveal the extent of economic transformation. Gold and silver that was once concentrated in noble treasuries and church coffers now circulates widely among former peasants who earn wages previously unimaginable. The surviving agricultural workers carry more coin than many pre-plague merchants, creating new patterns of consumption and investment that traditional economic theory can't explain. The luxury goods market has undergone complete transformation. Silk merchants who once catered exclusively to noble families now find their best customers among former serfs who have cash to spend and no traditional restrictions on their consumption. Sumptuary laws that regulated dress according to social class have become unenforceable when authorities can't distinguish between traditional nobles and recently enriched peasants. Economic power has replaced birth as the determinant of social status. The geographic mobility of labour represents perhaps the most radical departure from medieval economic norms. Workers who were once bound to particular manors now travel freely throughout the kingdom, seeking the best employment opportunities. This labour mobility creates the first truly competitive job market in European history, forcing employers to compete not just with wages but with working conditions, housing quality, and other benefits that were previously unnecessary to consider. The psychological transformation may be the most profound change of all. Workers who spent generations accepting economic exploitation as divinely ordained now negotiate as equals with employers who once held power of life and death over them. The internalized hierarchy that made feudal economics psychologically sustainable has been shattered by the simple experience of economic power. Former serfs speak with confidence about their worth, their rights, and their expectations in ways their ancestors never could have imagined. You observe the government's desperate attempts to restore pre-plague economic relationships through the Statute of Labourers, which attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility. But the law proves unenforceable when employers compete desperately for scarce labour, and workers can simply move to regions where authorities can't or won't enforce the restrictions. Economic reality has made feudal labour relations obsolete, regardless of legal attempts to preserve them. The long-term implications become clear as you complete your survey. The plague has accidentally created conditions that will lead to the end of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, and the eventual transformation of the European society from agricultural to commercial organisation. The great levelling brought about by mass death has given surviving workers economic power that will reshape civilization for centuries to come. December 1352 brings you to Florence, where something unprecedented is emerging from the ruins of medieval economic order. As a Genoese banker investigating new investment opportunities in the post-plague economy, you're witnessing the birth of economic relationships that have no precedent in human history. The combination of labour scarcity, accumulated capital from decreased population, and collapsed traditional restrictions has created space for innovations that will define the future of European commerce. The Medici Bank, reduced to a fraction of its pre-plague size but still possessing substantial accumulated wealth, has become a laboratory for new forms of economic organisation. Cosimo de' Medici explains his revolutionary approach as you examine ledgers that would have been impossible under pre-plague conditions. With so few workers available, we must make each one as productive as possible. That means better tools, more efficient organisation, and profit-sharing arrangements that give workers incentive to maximise their output. The workshop of Antonio Brunelleschi demonstrates these innovations in practice. Before the plague, cloth production operated through traditional guild structures where master craftsmen controlled small workshops, using techniques passed down through generations. Antonio has assembled the surviving textile workers in Florence into a single, large facility where specialisation and tool sharing create productivity levels that exceed anything achieved under the guild system. Each worker focuses on what they do best, Antonio explains, as he leads you through workshops that buzz with activity, despite employing fewer people than traditional cloth production required. Maria handles all the spinning because her output exceeds 3 normal spinners. Giuseppe manages the looms because he understands the mechanical adjustments better than anyone else. Instead of every craftsman doing every task poorly, each person does fewer tasks excellently. The financing arrangements supporting these innovations represent equally dramatic departures from medieval economic practice. The Medici Bank has developed new forms of partnership where investors provide capital in exchange for shares of future profits, rather than fixed interest payments. Workers receive not just wages but profit participation that aligns their incentives with production efficiency. These arrangements create economic relationships based on mutual benefit rather than traditional hierarchical exploitation. You observe the development of accounting practices that make such complex arrangements possible. Double-entry bookkeeping, refined under the pressure of managing scarce resources efficiently, allows precise tracking of costs, revenues, and profit distribution among multiple partners. The mathematical precision required to operate these new economic relationships forces innovations in financial record-keeping that will revolutionize commercial practice throughout Europe. The agricultural estates surrounding Florence show similar innovations in rural economic organization. The traditional manorial system has been replaced by contractual arrangements where surviving peasants operate farms as independent businesses, sharing profits with landowners who provide capital for tools, seeds, and livestock improvements. These agricultural partnerships create incentives for productivity improvements that were impossible under feudal labour obligations. Francesco Dattini, a merchant who survived the plague in Prato, has developed trading relationships that exploit the new economic realities created by population reduction. With fewer consumers but more money per consumer, demand has shifted toward higher quality goods, he explains. Instead of producing large quantities of cheap cloth for mass markets, we focus on luxury items for customers who have money to spend on superior products. The luxury market transformation represents a fundamental shift in European economic development. Surviving consumers, whether former peasants who now earn substantial wages, or nobles who inherited accumulated wealth from extinct family members, demand goods that combine functionality with aesthetic appeal. This creates opportunities for craftsworkers to develop skills and techniques that were previously restricted to court artisans serving only the highest nobility. You document the emergence of what economists will later recognize as early capitalist institutions. Investment partnerships pool resources from multiple contributors to finance projects too large for individual merchants. Risk sharing. Arrangements distribute potential losses among several parties, making innovations possible that would have been too dangerous for any single investor. These financial instruments create the foundation for economic enterprises of unprecedented scale and complexity. The geographic expansion of trade networks reflects the new economic dynamics. With traditional trade routes disrupted by plague depopulation, surviving merchants develop new commercial relationships that bypass the destroyed cities and focus on communities that maintained viable populations. The Venetian trade routes that once centered on Constantinople shift toward emerging markets in Poland and Hungary, where demographic recovery is proceeding more rapidly. The technological innovations emerging from labor scarcity represent another departure from medieval economic practice. Water-powered mills that were once used only for grinding grain are adapted for textile production, metalworking, and other manufacturing processes. The investment in mechanical devices that can multiply human productivity becomes economically viable when labour costs rise to levels that justify capital expenditure on efficiency improvements. The banking innovations extend far beyond simple credit relationships. The Medici Bank has developed insurance products that allow merchants to protect themselves against risks that were previously uninsurable. Political instability, currency fluctuations, and transportation hazards can now be transferred to financial institutions willing to accept such risks in exchange for premium payments. This risk management makes commercial ventures possible that would have been too dangerous under traditional economic arrangements. The social mobility created by these new economic relationships represents perhaps the most radical departure from medieval practice. Former peasants who demonstrate business capability can become partners in commercial ventures that would have been restricted to noble families before the plague. Merit-based advancement becomes possible in ways that challenge every assumption about social hierarchy and economic opportunity. You observe the psychological transformation that accompanies these institutional changes. Business relationships that were once based on personal loyalty and traditional obligation have been replaced by contractual arrangements that define mutual responsibilities precisely. The shift from personal to impersonal economic relationships creates space for innovations that transcend traditional social boundaries. The competitive pressures created by labour scarcity force continuous innovation in business practices. Companies that fail to offer attractive working conditions lose employees to competitors. Firms that can't match productivity improvements developed by rivals face extinction in newly competitive markets. This competitive dynamic drives economic development at rates that would have been impossible under traditional feudal arrangements. As you prepare your report for Genoese investors, the historical significance of these developments becomes clear. The plague has accidentally created conditions that make capitalist economic relationships not just possible, but necessary for survival. The innovations emerging from demographic catastrophe will eventually transform Europe from a feudal agricultural society into the foundation of the modern commercial world. The workshops of Florence continue their unprecedented experiments in economic organisation as you depart. Their success measured not in traditional measures of social status, but in the new metric that will define human progress for centuries to come: productivity per capita in increasingly specialised commercial enterprises. You're standing in the workshop of Andrea Orcagna in Florence, sometime in late 1350, watching the greatest artistic transformation in European history take place on wooden panels and stone walls. As a wealthy merchant commissioning religious art for your family chapel, you're witnessing how proximity to mass death changes not just what artists paint, but how they understand the very purpose of artistic creation. The plague hasn't just killed potential subjects, it's revolutionised the entire aesthetic sensibility of European civilization. Orcagna himself looks like a man who has seen hell and lived to paint it. His face bears the gaunt intensity common to plague survivors, and his hands shake slightly as he mixes pigments, not from illness, but from a nervous energy that seems to drive him through 18-hour work days. "I paint as if each painting might be my last," he tells you while applying gold leaf to a virgin's halo. Because it very well might be. Death has taught me that tomorrow is never guaranteed, so today's work must carry the weight of eternity. The artistic works emerging from plague-ravaged Europe represent a complete departure from the optimistic religious art of the early 14th century. Where once artists celebrated human dignity and divine beauty, now they focus obsessively on mortality, judgment, and the fragility of earthly existence. Orcagna's latest altarpiece depicts the Last Judgment with such terrifying detail that viewers recoil instinctively from Christ's vengeful expression and the graphic torments awaiting the damned. You examine the sketches scattered around the workshop, preliminary studies for works that may never be completed if their creator joins the ranks of plague victims. Every drawing reflects the new aesthetic priorities shaped by mass death: skeletal figures representing the universality of mortality, elaborate depictions of heaven and hell that suggest desperate hope for meaning beyond earthly suffering, portraits of saints that emphasize their martyrdom rather than their glory. The technical innovations developing in response to plague conditions represent practical adaptations to unprecedented circumstances. Artists work faster now, using techniques that sacrifice some refinement for speed of execution. Frescoes that once required months of careful preparation are completed in weeks, because no one knows if the chapel walls they're decorating will still be standing, or if the artists will still be alive to finish their work. The patronage system that supported medieval art has been transformed by demographic catastrophe. Traditional noble families who commissioned religious art for generations have been extinguished, their chapels standing empty, their artistic projects abandoned mid-completion. New patrons emerge from the ranks of plague survivors, former merchants who inherited wealth from deceased relatives, guild masters who accumulated resources from collapsed businesses, even prosperous peasants who now have money to spend on artistic commemoration. You witness a commission meeting that exemplifies the changed relationship between patron and artist. Master Giovanni da Milano negotiates with 3 different potential patrons simultaneously, playing them against each other in ways that would have been impossible when artistic talent was less scarce. The balance of power has shifted decisively towards surviving artists who can now demand not just higher fees but greater creative freedom in exchange for their increasingly rare skills. The subjects chosen for artistic representation reflect the psychological preoccupations of plague survivors. Traditional depictions of saints as intercessors who might prevent earthly suffering have given way to images of martyrs whose deaths demonstrate the meaninglessness of temporal existence. The Virgin Mary appears less frequently as a merciful mother figure, and more often as a sorrowful witness to human tragedy, who offers spiritual comfort but no earthly protection. The workshop itself tells the story of artistic transformation. Where once apprentices learned their craft through years of careful instruction, now they're rushed through abbreviated training programs because master artists need assistance immediately and can't wait for traditional skill development. The result is a generation of artists whose technical ability may be limited, but whose emotional intensity exceeds anything achieved by their predecessors. You observe Orcagna working on a fresco cycle depicting the triumph of death that will become one of the defining artistic monuments of the Plague era. His death appears not as the gentle medieval figure who releases souls to divine judgment, but as a terrifying harvester who cuts down saints and sinners with equal indifference. The image captures something essential about the plague experience, the seemingly random nature of survival and death that challenges every assumption about divine justice. The architectural projects commissioned in response to plague devastation represent another form of artistic innovation. Churches built to commemorate plague victims incorporate design elements that emphasize human mortality, skull motifs integrated into decorative schemes, inscriptions that remind viewers of death's inevitability, spatial arrangements that focus attention on altars where masses are said for the dead rather than celebrations of divine glory. The manuscript illumination produced in surviving monasteries shows similar thematic preoccupations. Books of Hours that once depicted seasonal agricultural activities now focus on preparation for death and judgment. Prayer books emphasize penitential psalms and meditations on mortality. The entire devotional literature of late medieval Christianity has been transformed by collective confrontation with mass death. The secular art commissioned by newly wealthy survivors reflects different but related concerns. Portrait paintings emphasize the temporary nature of earthly beauty and success through symbolic elements that remind viewers of mortality's approach. Decorative objects incorporate memento mori motifs that would have been inappropriate in pre-plague aristocratic culture, but seem natural to people who have witnessed civilization's fragility. The artistic techniques developing in response to changed aesthetic demands show remarkable innovation under pressure. Artists experiment with perspective and emotional expression in ways that anticipate Renaissance developments, driven not by theoretical interest in classical antiquity, but by immediate need to capture experiences that traditional artistic vocabulary cannot adequately represent. The international exchange of artistic ideas has been disrupted but not eliminated by plague conditions. The few artists who travel between cities carry not just their own innovations, but knowledge of different regional approaches to representing mortality and suffering. This cross-pollination creates stylistic developments that might have taken decades to emerge under normal conditions of gradual cultural change. The preservation of artistic works has become both more urgent and more difficult in post-plague conditions. With fewer people available to maintain churches and private collections, many artistic treasures risk destruction through simple neglect. Conversely, the reduced population means that surviving art objects have acquired enhanced emotional and spiritual significance for communities desperate to maintain cultural continuity. As you finalise your commission with Orcagna, paying prices that would have been unthinkable before the plague created scarcity among skilled artists, you understand that you're participating in one of history's great cultural transformations. The art emerging from Europe's encounter with mass death will influence aesthetic sensibility for centuries, introducing themes and techniques that will define the Renaissance and beyond. The workshop continues its feverish activity as you depart, paint and gold leaf being transformed into images that attempt to make sense of experiences that seem to transcend human understanding. Art, created in death's shadow that will outlive its creators and the catastrophe that inspired it. Spring 1353 finds you in Padua, in the study of Francesco Petrarca, watching the father of Renaissance humanism struggle to create literary meaning from experiences that seem to transcend human understanding. As a fellow poet and scholar, you're witnessing how the plague has transformed not just the content of European literature, but its fundamental assumptions about human purpose and divine providence. The Great Dying has created new forms of literary expression that will influence writing for centuries. Petrarch's desk overflows with unfinished manuscripts, letters to friends who are now dead, and poetry that attempts to capture experiences for which medieval literature had no adequate vocabulary. His latest sonnet sequence abandons the traditional celebration of courtly love for meditation on mortality, friendship's fragility, and the apparent randomness of survival. "How can I write of love's eternal beauty?" he asks, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "when beauty itself proves so temporary, when the beloved might perish between one verse and the next?" The transformation extends far beyond individual artistic vision to encompass fundamental changes in literary purpose and audience. Medieval literature once served primarily to edify readers through moral instruction and spiritual guidance, assuming stable communities where cultural transmission occurred gradually across generations. The plague has created literature of immediate urgency, written for audiences who might not survive to read tomorrow's composition. You examine manuscripts that demonstrate these changing priorities. Giovanni Boccaccio's latest stories, written in the shadow of Florentine devastation, focus obsessively on human ingenuity in the face of death and social collapse. His characters aren't the noble heroes of earlier medieval literature, but ordinary survivors using wit, courage, and luck to navigate unprecedented circumstances. The literary celebration of aristocratic virtue has been replaced by democratic admiration for anyone capable of staying alive. The audience for literature has been revolutionized by demographic catastrophe. Traditional patrons, noble families who commissioned elaborate manuscripts for their private libraries, have been largely eliminated. New readers emerge from the ranks of plague survivors, prosperous merchants who inherited libraries from deceased relatives, guild masters who now have money to spend on books, even former peasants who learn to read during the social upheaval and seek entertainment during long winter evenings. The vernacular languages gain unprecedented literary prestige as Latin scholarship declines, along with the clerical population that sustained it. Dante's decision to write his great poem in Italian rather than Latin, once considered a populist experiment, now seems prophetic. Writers across Europe discover that their native languages offer expressive possibilities that Latin, however elegant, cannot match for capturing the immediate experience of survival and loss. You observe Boccaccio working on his Decameron, a collection of stories framed by the plague itself. 10 young people flee plague-ravaged Florence to a country villa where they entertain each other with tales that explore every aspect of human nature, revealed by proximity to death. The framework is brilliant literary innovation, using the plague not just as background, but as the organising principle that makes the stories necessary and urgent. People need stories now more than ever, Boccaccio explains, while reviewing a tale about merchants who outwit death through clever planning. When the world no longer makes sense, when traditional authorities offer no guidance, stories become the way we understand what it means to be human. His literature serves as both entertainment and philosophy, for readers who must reconstruct meaning from the fragments of collapsed civilization. The religious literature emerging from plague conditions shows equally dramatic transformation. Traditional saints' lives that once emphasized miraculous interventions and divine protection now focus on holy figures who maintained faith despite suffering that God chose not to prevent. Prayer books include new devotions specifically for plague times, acknowledging that conventional religious comfort may be inadequate for unprecedented circumstances. The secular literature reflects changed social realities with remarkable sophistication. Courtly romance, which celebrated aristocratic values and elaborate social hierarchies, gives way to stories about merchants, craftsmen, and even peasants, whose intelligence and moral courage prove superior to traditional noble virtues. The democratic implications are revolutionary. Literary merit no longer depends on characters' social rank, but on their human qualities. The technical innovations in literary craft respond to changed conditions of composition and consumption. Writers develop more compressed narrative techniques, knowing that readers might not have time for elaborate development of character and plot. Poetic forms become more intense and immediate, focusing on moments of revelation rather than gradual unfolding of theme. The pace of literary expression accelerates to match the urgency of plague conditions. The manuscript production process itself reflects social transformation. Traditional scriptoriums operated by monastic communities have largely ceased functioning, replaced by commercial workshops where secular scribes copy texts for paying customers. The books being produced emphasize practical utility, medical treatises, devotional works, and literary entertainment, rather than the theological scholarship that once dominated manuscript culture. The international circulation of literary works has been disrupted but not eliminated by plague conditions. The few manuscripts that travel between cities carry stories of survival and adaptation that influence literary development across linguistic boundaries. Italian novelle influence French fabliaux, which adapt themes developed in German Schwenker, creating a pan-European literature of plague experience that transcends traditional cultural divisions. The preservation of classical literature has become both more urgent and more precarious. With monastic libraries abandoned and secular collections disrupted by owner deaths, many ancient texts risk permanent loss. Conversely, the scholars who survive develop unprecedented appreciation for literary works that seem to speak directly to experiences of suffering and uncertainty that medieval religious literature often avoided confronting. You witness a fascinating development in Petrarch's approach to classical antiquity. Instead of treating ancient authors as distant authorities whose wisdom must be respectfully transmitted, he engages them as contemporaries who face similar challenges of making meaning from suffering. His letters to Cicero and Virgil read like conversations between survivors, comparing strategies for a psychological survival in impossible circumstances. The vernacular poetry emerging from plague experience shows remarkable innovation in emotional expression. Traditional medieval verse emphasized collective religious experience and social harmony. Post-plague poetry explores individual consciousness with psychological sophistication that anticipates modern literary sensibility. Poets discover that extreme circumstances reveal aspects of human nature that stable societies keep hidden. The dramatic literature beginning to emerge from plague conditions represents perhaps the most radical innovation. Traditional medieval drama served primarily religious and educational functions, reinforcing community values through morality plays and scriptural reenactment. The new dramatic works explore moral ambiguity, individual choice under extreme pressure, and the apparent absence of divine intervention in human affairs. As you conclude your visit with Petrarch, examining manuscripts that represent literature's response to civilization's near collapse, the historical significance becomes clear. The plague has accidentally created conditions that will produce some of the greatest literary achievements in European history. The confrontation with mass death has liberated writers from conventional assumptions about human purpose and divine providence, opening creative possibilities that will define Renaissance and modern literature. The study continues its productive activity as you depart, quill pens scratching across parchment to create words that will outlive their authors and the catastrophe that inspired them. Literature born from humanity's darkest hours that will illuminate understanding for centuries to come. October 1353 brings you to the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, where the few surviving musicians are creating entirely new forms of musical expression from the ruins of medieval liturgical tradition. As a composer from the Burgundian court seeking to understand how the plague has transformed musical practice, you're witnessing innovations that will influence European music for centuries. The Great Dying has changed not just who makes music, but how music functions in human communities and what emotional territory it explores. The cathedral's choir, once numbering 40 trained voices capable of performing the most complex polyphonic masses in Christendom, now consists of 8 survivors whose individual talents have been forced to develop in ways that compensate for reduced numbers. Master Guillaume de Machaut, pale and gaunt from his own encounter with the plague, conducts rehearsals that sound nothing like the confident liturgical music of the pre-plague era. We sing differently now, he explains, while adjusting musical parts that must accommodate missing voice ranges. When death might silence any voice between one service and the next, each singer must carry more emotional weight, more spiritual responsibility. The music becomes more intense because it might be our final offering. His latest compositions show harmonic innovations that would have been considered too dissonant for liturgical use before the plague made conventional beauty seem inadequate to human experience. The musical instruments available for composition have been dramatically reduced by craftsman mortality. The organ that once filled Notre Dame's vast space with sound stands partially silent. 3 of its 5 sections no longer function because the master who knew how to repair them died in July. The workshops that produced lutes, viols, and wind instruments throughout Paris have mostly closed, their techniques lost with their practitioners. Musicians must make do with whatever instruments survive, leading to unusual combinations that produce new sonorities. You observe a funeral mass that demonstrates music's transformed role in post-plague religious practice. Instead of the elaborate polyphonic settings that once celebrated divine glory, the service features simple, haunting melodies that acknowledge grief without promising easy consolation. The musical expression has shifted from triumphant affirmation of religious truth to honest confession of human uncertainty in the face of apparent divine silence. The secular music emerging from plague conditions shows equally dramatic innovation. The courtly songs that once celebrated aristocratic love and social harmony have given way to compositions that explore loneliness, loss, and the search for meaning in circumstances that seem to resist human understanding. Machaut's latest ballades abandon traditional optimism for emotional complexity that previous musical conventions couldn't accommodate. The social context of musical performance has been revolutionized by demographic change. Noble courts that once maintained professional musicians for entertainment and ceremony now lack both performers and audiences. Musical activity has shifted to smaller, more intimate settings where surviving community members create and share music as a form of mutual psychological support rather than aristocratic display. The manuscript tradition that preserved musical knowledge across generations shows the same disruption, affecting all forms of cultural transmission. Many musical compositions exist in single copies because the scriptoriums that once produced multiple manuscripts of important works no longer function. The survival of musical knowledge has become a matter of individual memory rather than institutional preservation, making musical culture more fragile but also more urgent. You witness fascinating adaptations in musical pedagogy. Traditional musical education operated through long apprenticeships, where students gradually absorbed complex techniques over many years. The need for immediate musical competence to serve surviving communities has forced the development of accelerated teaching methods that focus on essential skills rather than comprehensive mastery. Young musicians learn to improvise and adapt existing music, rather than faithfully reproducing traditional performance practices. The liturgical music being composed for plague-affected communities incorporates new texts that address experiences for which traditional religious music had no adequate expression. Requiem masses include movements that acknowledge the impossibility of individual burial for plague victims. Penitential psalms are set to music that captures genuine anguish, rather than conventional religious humility. The musical settings make explicit the theological questions that official church doctrine prefers to avoid. The instrumental music developing in response to changed social conditions shows remarkable innovation in emotional expression. Dance music that once provided entertainment for large social gatherings has been transformed into smaller, more contemplative forms suitable for the reduced communities that survived the plague. The rhythmic vitality that characterized medieval dance gives way to more complex harmonic exploration that reflects the psychological sophistication of survivors. The geographic circulation of musical ideas has been both restricted and intensified by plague conditions. Fewer musicians travel between communities, reducing the normal exchange of musical innovations. However, the musicians who do travel carry enhanced cultural significance as representatives of artistic traditions that might otherwise disappear entirely. Musical ideas that survive transmission acquire special value for communities desperate to maintain cultural continuity. The acoustic properties of spaces where music is performed have changed dramatically due to population reduction. Cathedral music once designed for large congregations sounds hollow and over-resonant when performed for small groups of survivors. Composers adapt their techniques to create musical effects that work in partially empty spaces, developing new approaches to musical texture and timing that anticipate later developments in musical composition. You observe the development of musical forms that combine sacred and secular elements in ways that would have been considered inappropriate before the plague challenged traditional cultural boundaries. Compositions blend liturgical texts with vernacular poetry, religious melodies with dance rhythms, creating hybrid musical expressions that reflect the breakdown of medieval distinctions between spiritual and earthly concerns. The preservation of musical instruments has become both more urgent and more difficult in post-plague conditions. Many valuable instruments risk destruction through neglect, because their owners are dead, and survivors lack knowledge to maintain them properly. Conversely, the instruments that survive acquire enhanced emotional significance for communities that view them as connections to cultural traditions that the plague threatened to destroy entirely. The amateur musical practice emerging among survivors shows interesting departures from traditional patterns. People who never had time or opportunity to learn musical skills during their ordinary working lives now experiment with composition and performance as forms of personal expression and community bonding. This democratization of musical activity produces innovations that trained musicians might never have developed. As you conclude your research in the echoing spaces of Notre Dame, listening to musical expressions that capture human experiences at the extremes of suffering and endurance, the historical significance becomes clear. The plague has accidentally created conditions that will produce some of the most emotionally powerful and technically innovative music in European history. The confrontation with mass death has liberated composers from conventional assumptions about music's social function, opening creative possibilities that will influence musical development for centuries. The cathedral continues to resonate with new forms of musical expression as you depart, its stone walls carrying sounds that attempt to make sense of experiences that seem to transcend human understanding. Music created in death's shadow that will outlive its creators and the catastrophe that inspired it. It's spring 1354, and you're walking through the slowly recovering streets of London, documenting the first signs of what historians will later call one of the most rapid and dramatic social transformations in European history. As a chronicler for the restored royal court, you're witnessing how 5 years of demographic catastrophe have accidentally created conditions for innovations that will reshape civilization. The Great Dying is finally ending, but the Great Transformation has only just begun. The most striking change is visible in every workshop and marketplace you visit, the complete inversion of the economic relationships that governed European society for centuries. At the Guildhall of the Goldsmiths, Master Richard tells you about wage negotiations that would have been unthinkable before the plague. "My apprentices earn more in a month than I made in a year when I was learning the trade," he explains, with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "But they're worth every penny. Without them, the skills of our craft would die with my generation." The scarcity of skilled labour has forced innovations in production techniques that will eventually revolutionise European manufacturing. In the textile workshops near the Thames, you observe mechanical improvements designed to multiply individual worker productivity. Water-powered spinning wheels, improved looms that can be operated by single workers instead of teams, and organisational innovations that coordinate production across multiple crafts are all responses to simple demographic necessity. The social mobility unleashed by population collapse manifests in ways that challenge every assumption about medieval hierarchy. At the Boar's Head Tavern, you meet Thomas Carpenter, a former serf who now owns 3 workshops and employs a dozen craftsmen. "Death made equals of us all," he says, while reviewing account books that show profits exceeding those of pre-plague merchants. "What matters now is not who your grandfather was, but what you can do with your own hands and mind. The agricultural innovations emerging from rural depopulation represent equally dramatic departures from feudal practice. The Manor of Eastwick, which you visit on a sunny April morning, has been completely reorganised by its surviving inhabitants. Instead of the traditional strip farming that characterised medieval agriculture, they've consolidated holdings into larger, more efficient units worked by teams of farmers who share equipment and coordinate planting schedules. "We farm smarter now, not just harder," explains Margaret Miller, who has become the community's informal agricultural coordinator despite being a woman in a society that traditionally excluded women from such roles. "With fewer hands available, we must make every seed, every hour of labour, every tool produce maximum results. The old ways were wasteful. We couldn't afford waste when survival depended on efficiency. The technological adaptations forced by labour scarcity are accelerating developments that might have taken generations under normal circumstances. Mills that once served single communities now operate regional networks, processing grain from dozens of villages under management systems that require unprecedented coordination and record-keeping. The mathematical skills necessary to operate these complex arrangements are forcing literacy and numeracy improvements throughout the surviving population. The geographic mobility of survivors has created cultural exchange, patterns that break down regional barriers that existed for centuries. In London's markets, you encounter merchants from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and continental Europe who would never have left their home regions under pre-plague conditions. They bring new crops, different technologies, alternative approaches to crafts and trade that are spreading innovations across Europe faster than ever before in history. The religious innovations emerging from institutional collapse show equally promising developments. At St. Paul's Cathedral, Bishop Thomas explains how surviving Christian communities are developing new forms of worship that combine traditional liturgy with practices adapted to drastically reduce congregations. We've discovered that spiritual life doesn't require massive institutional apparatus, he says. Small communities can maintain faith, provide mutual support, and explore religious questions that were difficult to examine under traditional hierarchical authority. The educational experiments beginning in various communities represent perhaps the most significant long-term development. With most traditional schools closed and their masters dead, surviving communities have developed informal but effective systems for teaching essential skills to children and adults alike. These educational innovations emphasize practical knowledge, literacy, numeracy, basic craft skills, rather than the classical curriculum that once distinguished educated elites from common people. You observe one such educational experiment at the village of Westbrook, where former monk Brother Francis teaches reading, writing, and calculation to anyone interested in learning. His students include children as young as 6 and adults as old as 60. Former nobles and former serfs sitting side by side at wooden benches, united by shared recognition that knowledge has become the most valuable resource in post-plague society. The marriage and family patterns adapting to new demographic realities show remarkable flexibility and innovation. Traditional courtship customs based on property arrangements and social compatibility have given way to partnerships based on mutual economic benefit and emotional compatibility. You document numerous marriages between partners from different social classes, different regions, even different countries, unions that would have been impossible under pre-plague social restrictions. The legal innovations emerging from the breakdown of traditional authority structures anticipate developments that will eventually transform European governance. Communities that lost their traditional lords and magistrates have developed systems of collective decision-making, dispute resolution, and resource allocation that operate through discussion and consensus rather than hierarchical command. These experiments in democratic organisation are teaching valuable lessons about alternative approaches to social coordination. The urban planning, beginning to emerge in recovering cities, reflects new priorities shaped by plague experience. London's reconstruction emphasises sanitation, wider streets that reduce disease transmission, and public spaces that can accommodate community meetings and market activities. The medieval cities that often grew haphazardly are being rebuilt with conscious attention to public health and social functionality that anticipates modern urban design. The international trade relationships slowly developing among surviving commercial centres show innovative approaches to risk management and resource sharing. Merchants are developing insurance arrangements, partnership structures, and credit instruments that distribute commercial risks across multiple participants. These financial innovations are creating the institutional foundation for economic expansion that will eventually surpass pre-plague levels of commercial activity. The cultural preservation efforts being undertaken by surviving scholars and artists represent conscious attempts to maintain intellectual continuity while adapting to changed circumstances. In monasteries, universities, and private libraries throughout Europe, dedicated individuals are copying important manuscripts, teaching essential skills to younger people, and developing new forms of artistic expression that incorporate traditional techniques with innovations forced by current necessities. The military innovations adapting to reduced population demonstrate similar creativity under pressure. Traditional feudal armies based on personal loyalty relationships have given way to smaller, more professional forces that rely on superior training, better equipment, and tactical innovations rather than numerical superiority. These military developments are creating more efficient defence arrangements that require fewer people but achieve better results. As you complete your survey of London's recovery, examining evidence of social, economic, and cultural innovation emerging from demographic catastrophe, the historical significance becomes clear. the plague has accidentally created conditions that will accelerate European development in directions that would have been impossible under traditional medieval arrangements. The surviving communities are building not just numerical recovery but qualitative improvements that will define European civilization for centuries. The streets of London continue to bustle with unprecedented activity as you conclude your research. Survivors working with energy and innovation born from confronting civilization's fragility and discovering their own resilience and creativity in the face of ultimate challenges. August 1360 finds you in Prague, documenting how 7 years of recovery from the plague have created social and political arrangements that bear little resemblance to the medieval world that existed before the Great Dying. As a diplomat representing the restored French court, you're witnessing the emergence of new forms of governance, economic organisation, and international relations that will define the late medieval period and lay foundations for the modern world. The most dramatic transformation is visible in the relationship between rulers and subjects throughout Europe. King Charles IV of Bohemia, whom you're here to meet, governs territories where traditional feudal obligations have become largely meaningless due to population collapse. Instead of ruling through inherited hierarchies of noble vassals, he must negotiate directly with communities of survivors who have learned to organise themselves and can choose whether to accept royal authority. The old ceremonies of homage and fealty seem hollow now, Charles explains during a private audience in Rudchany Castle. When noble families have been extinguished and peasant communities govern themselves effectively, royal power must be earned through competence, rather than assumed through birthright. His court operates with half the officials of pre-plague administrations, but accomplishes more through improved efficiency and direct communication with local communities. The economic relationships supporting royal authority have been revolutionised by demographic change. Traditional taxation based on agricultural production has become impossible when so much land lies empty. Instead, Charles has developed commercial arrangements with surviving communities, providing military protection, legal arbitration, and infrastructure maintenance in exchange for agreed-upon payments, negotiated like business contracts, rather than imposed through feudal obligation. You observe a royal council meeting that demonstrates these changed political dynamics. Representatives from Prague's guilds, rural communities, and even former serf villages participate in discussions about tax policy, military recruitment, and legal reform with authority that would have been unthinkable under traditional feudal arrangements. The king listens to advice from people who would never have been permitted to address royal authority before the plague broke down social barriers. The international diplomacy you're conducting reflects similar transformations throughout Europe. Traditional alliances based on marriage connections between royal families have become impossible to maintain when so many dynasties have been extinguished by plague. Instead, diplomatic relationships now focus on practical arrangements for mutual benefit, trade agreements, military cooperation against bandits, coordination of recovery efforts, rather than the abstract claims of dynastic honour that once drove European politics. The legal innovations emerging from these new political arrangements represent fundamental departures from medieval jurisprudence. The elaborate legal codes based on Roman law and feudal custom have proven inadequate for governing communities where traditional social categories no longer apply. Charles has authorised legal experiments that emphasise practical dispute resolution and community consensus rather than adherence to ancient precedent. You witness a court session where these innovations operate in practice. A dispute between a former noble family and a community of surviving peasants over land rights is resolved through negotiation and compromise, rather than rigid application of feudal law. The judge focuses on finding solutions that serve community welfare, rather than preserving traditional privilege. The legal process serves practical functionality, rather than theoretical consistency. The military arrangements supporting royal authority show equally dramatic adaptation to changed demographics. Traditional feudal armies based on knight service from landed vassals have become impossible to maintain when so many noble families are extinct. Charles has developed professional military forces recruited from survivors regardless of social background, paid through taxation rather than supported through land grants, and organised around competence rather than hereditary rank. The urban governance emerging in recovered cities represents another form of political innovation. Prague's city council includes representatives from craft guilds, merchant associations, and neighbourhood communities who participate in municipal decision-making through procedures that resemble modern democratic consultation. These governing arrangements develop organically from practical necessity rather than theoretical political philosophy, but they create precedents for popular participation in government. The religious authority supporting political legitimacy has been transformed by institutional disruption. Traditional claims of divine sanction mediated through church hierarchy seem less convincing when bishops and abbots died at the same rate as common people. Instead, Charles presents his authority as practical leadership serving community welfare rather than mystical representation of divine will. This pragmatic approach to royal legitimacy anticipates later developments in political theory. The economic policies being developed to support recovery represent sophisticated understanding of demographic and commercial realities. Instead of simply attempting to restore pre-plague economic arrangements, Charles encourages innovations that take advantage of changed circumstances, supporting new industries that can operate with reduced labour, promoting trade routes that connect surviving population centres, investing in infrastructure improvements that multiply productivity rather than merely preserving traditional activities. The international trade relationships developing among European kingdoms reflect similar adaptation to new realities. Commercial agreements focus on exchanging surplus resources from regions that recovered quickly for specialised products from areas with surviving craft expertise. These trade networks are creating economic interdependencies that transcend traditional political boundaries and provide stronger foundations for international cooperation than dynastic marriage alliances ever achieved. The cultural policies supporting political authority show remarkable sophistication in adapting to changed social conditions. Charles patronises artists, scholars and craftsmen not primarily for personal glorification, but as conscious investment in cultural recovery that serves community welfare. The royal court becomes a centre for preserving and developing intellectual and artistic traditions that might otherwise be lost due to institutional collapse. The administrative innovations being implemented throughout the kingdom demonstrate systematic thinking about governance under unprecedented conditions. Record-keeping systems track population recovery, economic development, and resource allocation with precision that exceeds pre-plague administrative capabilities. The reduced scale of government operations paradoxically enables more detailed attention to effective management and community responsiveness. You document the emergence of what political theorists will later recognise as early forms of social contract theory. Communities accept royal authority in exchange for specific services and protections, rather than abstract obligations based on traditional hierarchy. These arrangements create mutual responsibilities that make governance more effective while limiting arbitrary exercises of power. The geographic administration of the kingdom reflects practical adaptation to population distribution that bears little resemblance to traditional territorial divisions. Administrative boundaries are redrawn to reflect actual community locations rather than historical precedent. Officials are assigned based on demonstrated competence in managing recovery efforts rather than hereditary claims to particular regions. As you conclude your diplomatic mission, preparing reports that will inform French royal policy about these remarkable political innovations, the historical significance becomes clear. The plague has accidentally created conditions that are forcing the development of more effective, responsive, and pragmatic forms of government. The political arrangements emerging from demographic catastrophe will influence European governance for centuries, contributing to eventual developments in representative government, social contract theory, and modern state administration. Prague continues its experiments in post-plague governance as you depart, its streets and buildings testament to human adaptability and creativity in reconstructing civilization under conditions that no previous generation ever faced or imagined possible. December 1375 brings you to Florence, where something unprecedented is crystallizing from 2 decades of post-plague cultural innovation. As a scholar from the University of Paris investigating educational developments, you're witnessing the birth of what later historians will call the Renaissance, not simply a revival of classical learning, but a fundamental transformation in how European culture understands human potential and achievement. The demographic catastrophe has accidentally created conditions for intellectual and artistic developments that will influence civilization for centuries. The transformation is most visible in the workshop of Filippo Brunelleschi, where architectural innovations that seemed impossible under medieval technical constraints are becoming practical realities. The labour shortage that forced increased productivity per worker has led to mechanical innovations, improved mathematical understanding, and engineering techniques that exceed anything achieved in classical antiquity. We build differently now, Brunelleschi explains while reviewing plans for his revolutionary dome design for Florence's cathedral. With fewer hands available, we must make each stone, each beam, each calculation achieve maximum effect through superior understanding rather than brute force. The intellectual life emerging from Florence's recovery demonstrates similar innovations born from necessity. The few surviving scholars have abandoned the medieval university system's emphasis on commentary and interpretation in favour of direct engagement with primary sources and original investigation. Coluccio Salutati, the city's chancellor, maintains a library where classical manuscripts are studied not as distant authorities, but as contemporary voices offering insights relevant to current challenges. The ancients faced catastrophes similar to our own, Salutati explains while showing you Greek and Roman texts that address political collapse, demographic crisis, and cultural recovery. Their wisdom becomes practical guidance rather than academic exercise, when we recognise that human challenges remain constant across centuries. We study them not to worship the past, but to understand the present. This approach to classical learning emphasises application rather than veneration, creating scholarship that serves contemporary needs rather than abstract theoretical interests. The artistic innovations developing throughout Florence reflect changed social conditions that make new forms of expression both possible and necessary. The patron system that once restricted artistic commissions to traditional religious and aristocratic themes has been democratized by economic transformation. Former guildmasters, successful merchants, and even prosperous craftsmen now commission art that celebrates human achievement and explores individual psychology with unprecedented sophistication. You observe Andrea Ocanha's students working on frescoes that demonstrate these new artistic priorities. Instead of the stylized religious imagery that dominated medieval art, they create realistic human figures engaged in contemporary activities, set in believable environments that demonstrate mastery of perspective and proportion. The technical innovations serve artistic vision that celebrates human dignity and capability rather than simply illustrating religious doctrine. The educational experiments taking place throughout the city represent perhaps the most significant long-term development. Traditional medieval education operated through rigid hierarchies, where students passively received inherited knowledge from authoritative sources. The disrupted institutional structure has created space for educational approaches that emphasize active investigation, critical thinking, and practical application of learning to real-world challenges. You visit a school operated by Vittorino da Feltre, where students from diverse social backgrounds study together using methods that would have been revolutionary under normal medieval conditions. The curriculum combines classical languages with mathematics, natural philosophy with moral instruction, artistic training with practical skills. Students participate in discussions rather than simply memorizing assigned texts, conduct original research rather than copying traditional commentaries, and apply their learning to contemporary problems rather than abstract theoretical questions. The literary culture emerging from these educational innovations shows remarkable sophistication in exploring human psychology and social relationships. Petrarch's followers develop poetic techniques that capture individual emotional experience with psychological precision that medieval literature rarely attempted. Boccaccio's narrative innovations demonstrate understanding of character development and social dynamics that anticipate modern literary accomplishment. The technological innovations emerging from post-plague Florence demonstrate systematic application of mathematical and engineering principles to practical problems. Water management systems, mechanical devices for textile production, architectural techniques for supporting unprecedented structural loads all reflect increased understanding of natural philosophy applied to human needs. The necessity of maximizing productivity with reduced labor has forced scientific thinking about efficiency and effectiveness. The political theory developing from Florence's experience of self-governance under extreme conditions, represents equally significant intellectual achievement. The city-state's survival required unprecedented cooperation among social groups that would have been impossible under traditional hierarchical arrangements. Political theorists are beginning to articulate principles of civic engagement, mutual responsibility, and collective decision-making that will influence democratic theory for centuries. You document the international exchange of ideas that makes these innovations possible despite reduced population and disrupted communication networks. Scholars, artists, and craftsmen who travel between recovering cities carry knowledge that combines rapidly across regional boundaries. The intellectual cross-pollination produces developments that exceed what any single community could achieve in isolation. The preservation and transmission of classical knowledge has been transformed from passive conservation to active engagement that makes ancient learning relevant to contemporary challenges. Manuscript copying has become selective and purposeful, rather than comprehensive and ritualistic. Scholars choose texts based on their utility for addressing current problems, rather than their traditional authority or religious acceptability. The religious thought adapting to these intellectual developments shows similar innovation and sophistication. Humanist scholars are developing approaches to Christian theology that emphasize human dignity, individual moral responsibility, and the compatibility of classical wisdom with religious truth. These theological innovations make possible the integration of secular learning with spiritual development that will characterize Renaissance culture. The economic theory emerging from Florence's commercial recovery demonstrates systematic thinking about market relationships, resource allocation, and productive efficiency that exceeds medieval understanding of economic processes. The necessity of operating with reduced population has forced innovations in commercial organization, risk management, and investment strategy that will influence capitalist development throughout Europe. The artistic theory being developed to explain and teach new techniques represents conscious reflection on aesthetic principles that medieval culture rarely examined explicitly. Treatises on perspective, proportion, and artistic psychology are creating theoretical foundations for artistic practice that will guide creative development for centuries. The combination of practical technique with philosophical understanding makes possible artistic achievements that transcend mere craft skill. As you complete your investigation of Florence's cultural innovations, preparing reports that will influence educational policy throughout Europe, the historical significance becomes clear. The plague's demographic catastrophe has accidentally created conditions that accelerate cultural development in directions that will define European civilization. The intellectual, artistic, and social innovations emerging from recovery efforts represent not just numerical restoration, but qualitative transformation that will influence human culture for centuries. Florence continues its remarkable cultural experimentation as you depart, its workshops and schools testament to human creativity unleashed by confronting civilization's fragility and discovering unprecedented possibilities for intellectual and artistic achievement. The Renaissance has begun, born from humanity's darkest hours, but destined to illuminate understanding for generations yet unborn. The Black Death claimed between 75 and 200 million lives across 4 devastating years, making it history's deadliest pandemic. But from the ashes of medieval civilization rose innovations that would define the modern world: capitalism, democracy, scientific thinking, artistic realism, and individual rights. The Great Dying ended, but the great transformation it unleashed continues to shape human civilization today, proving that even humanity's darkest hours can become the foundation for unprecedented achievement and progress. The plague ships that entered European harbours in 1347 carried not just death, but the seeds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world itself.